Every creature alive today exists because something, somewhere, at some point in the deep past, learned how to kill. Before civilization, before agriculture, before the first flicker of human consciousness, the land was ruled by predators so powerful, so perfectly adapted to their world, that they shaped the course of evolution itself. From scorpions the size of house cats to tyrannical reptiles whose bite could crush bone like wet paper, the history of terrestrial predation is a story written in claw marks and fossilized teeth, a saga spanning more than 400 million years. This is the story of the most dangerous land predators that ever lived. Period by period. Era by era. From the first tentative steps onto dry land to the thundering footfalls of the greatest killing machines evolution has ever produced. We are going to walk through deep time, and we are going to meet every nightmare that ruled the earth before we did. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now let us begin at the beginning. Not at the beginning of predators, exactly, but at the beginning of complex animal life itself. Because before we can understand what made the greatest terrestrial predators so extraordinary, we first have to understand the world they emerged from, a world where, for the longest time, there were no land predators at all. We live on a planet that is roughly 4.5 billion years old. For the majority of that time, an incomprehensibly vast stretch of deep geological history, the land was barren. Completely, utterly, profoundly barren. There were no trees. No grass. No insects humming through the air. No worms burrowing through soil. There was, in fact, no soil at all in the way we understand it. The continents existed, of course. Tectonic forces had been pushing and pulling the crust for billions of years, raising mountains and opening oceans and grinding land masses together in slow, colossal collisions. But the surfaces of those continents were nothing more than bare rock and mineral dust, scoured by wind and rain, baked by an unshielded sun, utterly devoid of the biological machinery that makes modern landscapes possible. All of life, every single organism on the planet, was in the water. The oceans were the cradle of everything. And they had been for a very, very long time. For roughly the first 3 billion years of Earth's existence, life was microscopic. Single-celled organisms, bacteria and archaea, dominated every aquatic niche. They formed mats on the ocean floor. They floated in the water column. They clustered around hydrothermal vents in the abyssal darkness. Some of them, the cyanobacteria, performed a chemical trick that would eventually reshape the entire planet. They photosynthesized. They took in carbon dioxide and water and sunlight and produced oxygen as a waste product. Over hundreds of millions of years, that oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, slowly, gradually, molecule by molecule, transforming the chemistry of the air and the seas. This was the Great Oxygenation Event, one of the most consequential developments in the history of life, and it set the stage for everything that followed. But even after oxygen began to accumulate, even after the atmosphere started to resemble something vaguely like the one we breathe today, it took an extraordinarily long time for life to become complex. The jump from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms was not a simple or inevitable one. It required new forms of cellular cooperation, new methods of genetic regulation, new strategies for growth and reproduction that had never existed before. The details of how and why this transition occurred are still debated by biologists today, but we know that by roughly 600 million years ago, the first complex multicellular organisms had appeared in the oceans. These were the creatures of the Ediacaran period, the strange and enigmatic organisms that represent the earliest known examples of large-scale multicellular life. They were soft-bodied, many of them flat and frond-like, and they bore little resemblance to anything alive today. Some of them, like the famous Dickinsonia, looked like quilted pancakes resting on the sea floor. Others resembled ferns or fans or strange geometric blobs. They had no eyes, no mouths, no limbs, no shells, no obvious means of locomotion in most cases. They were, by any reasonable definition, not predators. Most of them appeared to have absorbed nutrients directly from the water or from microbial mats on the ocean floor. They lived in a world without teeth, without claws, without the fundamental biological arms race that would come to define the later history of animal life. And then everything changed. Approximately 540 million years ago, at the boundary between the Ediacaran and the Cambrian period, the fossil record explodes. This is the Cambrian explosion, one of the most dramatic and important events in the entire history of life on Earth. In a geologically brief span of time, perhaps 10 to 20 million years, the oceans filled with an astonishing diversity of complex animal forms. Suddenly, or at least suddenly by geological standards, there were animals with hard shells, jointed limbs, compound eyes, grasping appendages, and most importantly for our story, mouths designed for predation. The Cambrian explosion marks the true beginning of the predator-prey dynamic that has driven evolution ever since. For the first time, animals were actively hunting and consuming other animals. The arms race had begun. And it would never stop. But here is the critical point, the thing that frames our entire story. The Cambrian explosion happened in the oceans. Every single one of those extraordinary new animals, the trilobites with their crystalline eyes, the anomalocarids with their great grasping appendages, the tiny Wawaxia armored with scales and spines, all of them were aquatic. The land was still empty. The continents were still bare rock and dust and thin crusts of microbial life. There were no plants on land, or at least none that we can detect in the fossil record. There were no animals on land. There was nothing. And so the Cambrian period, for all its revolutionary importance to the history of life, is a blank page in the story of terrestrial predation. There were no land predators in the Cambrian because there was nothing on land to hunt, and nothing on land to do the hunting. This is a fact worth pausing on, because it speaks to something fundamental about the challenge of living on land. Water is, in many ways, a far more hospitable medium for life than air. Water supports the body, reduces the effects of gravity, provides a ready medium for the exchange of gases and nutrients, and offers a relatively stable thermal environment. An organism living in the sea does not need to worry about drying out, does not need specialized structures to support its own weight, does not need lungs or any other complex apparatus for extracting oxygen from the atmosphere. Life in water is, in a certain fundamental sense, easier than life on land. The transition from water to land is one of the most challenging things that evolution has ever accomplished. It required a complete reimagining of almost every biological system. Organisms moving onto land needed new ways to breathe, new ways to support their bodies against gravity, new ways to reproduce without the surrounding medium of water, new ways to prevent desiccation, new ways to sense their environment. Every one of these challenges had to be solved, and they had to be solved incrementally, through the slow, blind process of natural selection, which has no foresight and no plan. It is not surprising, then, that the colonization of the land was a slow process. Life had been thriving in the oceans for billions of years before the first organisms made the tentative move onto dry ground. And even then, the first colonizers were not animals. They were plants. Or rather, they were the evolutionary ancestors of what we would come to know as plants. The earliest evidence of land plants dates to the Ordovician period, roughly 470 million years ago. These were not trees or bushes or anything we would recognize as a modern plant. They were tiny, simple organisms, probably similar to modern liverworts or mosses, low-growing mats of green tissue that hugged the ground near water sources. They had no roots, no stems, no leaves, no flowers, no seeds. They were little more than photosynthetic tissue clinging to the edges of streams and shorelines. But they were there. They were on land. And their presence would begin the slow, transformative process of turning bare rock into something resembling soil, creating the conditions that would eventually allow animals to follow. The Ordovician period, which lasted from roughly 485 to 443 million years ago, was a time of extraordinary marine biodiversity. The oceans were full of life. The Great Ordovician biodiversification event produced an explosion of new species, including vast reefs built by bryozoans and stromatoporids, diverse communities of brachiopods and crinoids and nautiloids, and an increasing diversity of predatory arthropods and early vertebrates. In the seas, the predator-prey arms race was well underway. Giant orthocone nautiloids, straight-shelled cephalopods that could reach lengths of several meters, were among the apex predators of the Ordovician oceans, cruising through the water and snatching prey with their tentacles. But on land, the story was entirely different. The Ordovician continents remained almost completely devoid of animal life. Those tiny, primitive land plants were spreading slowly, colonizing moist habitats near the water's edge, but they had not yet created the complex terrestrial ecosystems that would be necessary to support animal populations. There was no significant soil. There was no leaf litter. There was no decaying organic matter, at least not in quantities sufficient to support communities of decomposers and detritivores. The land was greening, but only just barely, and only in the most favorable environments. There may have been some arthropods venturing onto land during the Ordovician. Trackways that might have been made by early millipede-like creatures have been found in Ordovician rocks, though the interpretation of these trace fossils is debated. If animals were on land at all during this period, they were small, they were restricted to wet environments near the water, and they were almost certainly not predators. They would have been detritivores at best, feeding on decaying plant material and microbial mats. The Ordovician period ended with one of the most severe mass extinctions in Earth's history. A sudden and dramatic glaciation event, possibly triggered by a gamma-ray burst from a nearby supernova, caused global temperatures to plummet and sea levels to drop precipitously. Marine ecosystems were devastated. Roughly 85% of marine species went extinct. It was a catastrophic reset button for ocean life, and it had significant implications for the subsequent history of the planet. But on land, where complex life had barely gained a foothold, the effects of the extinction were minimal. There was almost nothing on land to kill. So we have now passed through two entire geological periods, the Cambrian and the Ordovician, spanning roughly 100 million years, and we have yet to encounter a single terrestrial predator. The land remains a frontier, a vast and mostly empty stage waiting for actors that have not yet evolved. The story of terrestrial predation has not yet begun. But it is about to. The Silurian period, which followed the Ordovician and lasted from approximately 443 to 419 million years ago, represents a crucial turning point in the history of life on land. This is the period when the first definitive evidence of terrestrial animal life appears in the fossil record, and it is the period when the foundations of terrestrial ecosystems were laid. The Silurian world was very different from our own. The continents were arranged in unfamiliar configurations. The great supercontinent of Gondwana dominated the southern hemisphere, while smaller land masses were scattered across the tropics and northern regions. The climate was generally warm, and sea levels were high, flooding large areas of the continental shelves with shallow, sunlit seas. The marine ecosystems, recovering from the end-Ordovician extinction, were diversifying rapidly. The first true coral reefs appeared. Jawed fish began to evolve. The oceans were becoming increasingly complex and competitive. On land, the most significant development was the continued evolution and spread of terrestrial plants. Silurian plants were still small and simple by later standards, but they were becoming more diverse and more structurally complex. Some of them developed rudimentary vascular tissue, the internal plumbing that allows plants to transport water and nutrients from their roots to their above-ground tissues. This was a revolutionary adaptation, because it meant that plants were no longer confined to the immediate edges of water bodies. They could grow slightly taller, spread slightly farther from streams and ponds, and begin to colonize habitats that had previously been too dry for photosynthetic life. As the plant cover expanded, it created new opportunities for animals. Decaying plant matter accumulated on the ground, forming the beginnings of soil and leaf litter. This organic material was a food source, and it attracted the first wave of terrestrial animal colonizers, the detritivores. And this is where the myriapods enter our story. Myriapods are a group of arthropods that includes the modern millipedes and centipedes. They are characterized by their elongated bodies and numerous pairs of legs. Today, they are found in almost every terrestrial habitat on the planet, from tropical rainforests to temperate woodlands to the edges of deserts. They are among the most successful groups of terrestrial invertebrates, and they have been on land for a very long time. The earliest myriapods appear in the fossil record during the Silurian period. These were small creatures, probably only a few centimeters long, and they bore a general resemblance to modern millipedes. They had segmented bodies, multiple pairs of legs, and mouthparts adapted for chewing. Based on their anatomy and on comparisons with their modern descendants, most paleontologists believe that these early myriapods were detritivores. They fed on decaying plant material, fungal hyphae, and microbial mats. They were recyclers, processing dead organic matter and returning nutrients to the thin, nascent soils of the Silurian land. Now, the distinction between detritivores and predators is important here, and it is worth exploring in some detail. A detritivore eats dead organic matter. It does not hunt. It does not chase down prey. It does not need speed or strength or sensory acuity, or any of the other attributes that we associate with predatory behavior. A detritivore simply wanders through the leaf litter, consuming whatever decaying material it encounters. It is a fundamentally passive lifestyle, one that does not require the complex adaptations that define a predator. The early Silurian myriapods, as far as we can tell, were exactly this kind of organism. They were not hunters. They were not killers. They were humble recyclers, quietly processing dead plant matter in the thin strip of greenery along the edges of streams and coastlines. They were among the very first animals to live on land, but they were not predators. However, and this is a crucial however, the myriapod lineage would eventually produce something very different from a millipede. Centipedes, the predatory branch of the myriapod family tree, would eventually evolve from within this group. Modern centipedes are active, aggressive predators, equipped with venomous forcipules, modified legs near the head that function as fangs. They hunt insects, spiders, and other small invertebrates, and some of the larger tropical species can even take small vertebrates like lizards and mice. But in the Silurian, this predatory lineage had not yet fully emerged. The myriapods of this period were, as we have said, mostly or entirely detritivores. They represent a critical first step in the colonization of the land by animal life, but they do not yet represent the beginning of terrestrial predation. The Silurian period is therefore a transitional time. The pieces are being put in place. Plants are spreading across the land, creating the basis for terrestrial food webs. Arthropods are making the move from water to land, establishing themselves in the new terrestrial environments. But the web of life on land is still extremely simple. There are primary producers, the plants and the microbial communities. There are primary consumers, the detritivores that feed on dead plant matter. But the third trophic level, the predators, has not yet fully materialized. This situation is not going to last. The Devonian period follows the Silurian and spans from approximately 419 to 359 million years ago. This is one of the most transformative periods in the entire history of life on Earth. It is sometimes called the Age of Fishes because of the extraordinary diversification of fish during this time, but that marine-centric name does not do justice to the equally revolutionary changes that were occurring on land. During the Devonian, terrestrial ecosystems underwent a dramatic transformation. Plants evolved at a breathtaking pace. The simple, low-growing plants of the Silurian gave way to a new generation of larger, more complex species. Vascular tissue became more sophisticated, allowing plants to grow taller and transport water more efficiently. Roots appeared for the first time, anchoring plants into the ground and allowing them to draw water and nutrients from deeper soil layers. Leaves evolved, vastly increasing the photosynthetic surface area of individual plants. And by the late Devonian, the first true trees had appeared. The evolution of forests was one of the most consequential events in the history of life on land. Trees changed everything. They created shade, which modified ground-level temperature and humidity. They produced vast quantities of leaf litter, which accumulated and decomposed and built up thick, rich soils. Their roots broke apart rock and stabilized sediment, preventing erosion and creating the stable substrates that other organisms needed. They created three-dimensional habitats, with canopy layers and understory layers and ground layers, each offering different conditions and different ecological opportunities. The Devonian forests were not like modern forests. The trees were not oaks or maples or pines. They were strange, alien-looking plants, things like Archaeopteris, which looked somewhat like a conifer but reproduced with spores rather than seeds, and Wadiza, a tree fern relative that could reach heights of 8 meters or more. The understory was filled with ferns and horsetails and club mosses, a lush green carpet of vegetation that was entirely different from anything the planet had seen before. And with this explosion of plant life came an explosion of animal life on land. The Devonians saw a dramatic increase in the diversity and abundance of terrestrial arthropods. More species of myriapods appeared. Mites and other tiny arachnids colonized the soil and leaf litter. Springtails and other hexapods began to diversify. The land was filling up with small invertebrates, and as the populations of these herbivores and detritivores grew, the conditions were finally right for the emergence of predators. And so we come to the Trigonotarbids. Trigonotarbids are an extinct order of arachnids, and they are among the most important animals in the history of terrestrial predation. They were not spiders, though they were closely related to spiders. They were not scorpions, though they shared the same broad arachnid family tree. They were their own distinct group, with their own unique combination of features, and they were among the very first fully terrestrial predators in the history of life on Earth. The Trigonotarbids first appear in the fossil record in the late Silurian, but they became much more diverse and abundant during the Devonian. They ranged in size from a few millimeters to perhaps a couple of centimeters, small by the standards of later predators, but significant in the context of their time. They had 8 legs, like all arachnids, and they had segmented bodies covered in a tough, armored cuticle. Their mouthparts included chelicerae, the pincer-like structures that arachnids use to manipulate and process food. Some species may have had book lungs, the internal respiratory organs that allow modern spiders and scorpions to breathe air efficiently. What makes the Trigonotarbids so significant is not their size or their ferocity, but their ecological role. They were, as far as we can determine from their anatomy and from the ecosystems in which they lived, active predators. They hunted other small arthropods. They chased down their prey, seized it with their appendages, and consumed it. This may sound unremarkable to us, living as we do in a world teeming with predators of every size and description, but in the context of the Devonian, it was revolutionary. Consider what had come before. For hundreds of millions of years, the land had been devoid of animal predators. The first animals to move onto land were detritivores, organisms that fed on dead matter. The Trigonotarbids represent the first definitive evidence of a new kind of ecological relationship on land, one where one animal actively hunts and kills another animal. This is predation, the fundamental dynamic that drives the evolutionary arms race, that selects for speed and strength and sensory acuity and defensive adaptations, that shapes the bodies and behaviors of every animal in the ecosystem. The Trigonotarbids were small. They were quiet. They left only faint traces in the fossil record. But in a very real sense, they were the founders of an ecological tradition that would eventually produce everything from praying mantises to great white sharks to Tyrannosaurus rex. They were the first land killers. One of the most famous and well-preserved Trigonotarbid fossils was discovered in rocks dating to the early Devonian. This specimen, preserved in extraordinary detail, shows the animal's body structure with remarkable clarity. The segmented abdomen, the 8 legs, the chelicerae, even details of the cuticle texture are visible. Studying this fossil and others like it, paleontologists have been able to reconstruct the basic lifestyle of these early predators. They were ground dwellers, living in the leaf litter and soil of the early Devonian forests. They probably hunted by ambush or by active pursuit, using their legs to chase down smaller arthropods and their chelicerae to seize and subdue prey. They may have been tactile hunters, relying on vibrations and direct contact to locate their food, or they may have had some form of visual perception, though the eyes of Trigonotarbids are not always well preserved. Their prey would have included the mites, springtails, and other tiny invertebrates that populated the Devonian soil ecosystem. These small creatures were abundant, and the Trigonotarbids would have had no shortage of food. But they were also small predators, operating at the very bottom of the predatory hierarchy. They were not apex predators by any meaningful definition. They were tiny, generalized hunters, occupying a niche that is today filled by thousands of species of spiders, pseudoscorpions, and other small arachnids. But they were the beginning. And beginnings matter. To understand why the trigonotarbids were able to evolve as terrestrial predators when no other group had done so before, we need to think about the arachnid body plan and why it was so well suited to life on land. Arachnids are arthropods, which means they have exoskeletons, jointed legs, and segmented bodies. The arthropod exoskeleton is a remarkable structure, a tough, flexible external shell made of chitin and other organic polymers. It serves as both a structural framework and a protective barrier, keeping the animal's internal organs safe from damage and, crucially, preventing water loss. Water loss is one of the greatest challenges facing any terrestrial organism. On land, surrounded by dry air rather than water, organisms constantly lose moisture through evaporation. For a small animal with a high surface area to volume ratio, this problem is especially acute. Without some mechanism to prevent desiccation, a small terrestrial animal would dry out and die within hours. The arthropod exoskeleton solves this problem. It is coated with a thin layer of waxy, hydrophobic material that dramatically reduces water loss through the cuticle. This waterproofing is one of the key adaptations that allowed arthropods to colonize the land so successfully, and it is one of the reasons why arthropods were the first animals to establish permanent terrestrial populations. Arachnids, in particular, were well equipped for terrestrial life. Their book lungs, which evolved from the gill-like structures of their aquatic ancestors, allowed them to breathe air efficiently while minimizing water loss. Their compact body plan, with the body divided into just two main sections, the prosoma and the opistosoma, was mechanically efficient and structurally strong. Their chelicerae were versatile feeding structures that could be adapted for a variety of diets, from herbivory to detritivory to predation. In the Devonian, with the expansion of terrestrial ecosystems creating new opportunities and new food sources, the arachnid body plan proved to be supremely adaptable. Trigonotarbids were just one branch of the arachnid family tree that diversified during this period. Others included the earliest true scorpions, though some of these were still aquatic or semi-aquatic, and the earliest mites, which colonized the soil in enormous numbers. The Devonian was also the period when another momentous event occurred, one that would have profound implications for the future of terrestrial predation. This was the evolution of tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates that would eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. The earliest tetrapods evolved from lobe-finned fish during the late Devonian, gradually adapting their fins into limbs and developing the ability to breathe air. Iconic species like Tiktaalik and Acanthostiga represent transitional forms in this process, showing a mix of fish-like and amphibian-like features. But it is important to note that these early tetrapods were not yet fully terrestrial. They were aquatic or semi-aquatic creatures, still tied to the water for reproduction and probably for most of their daily activities. They were not yet land predators in the sense that we are discussing. Their significance lies in the future, in what their descendants would become. For now, in the Devonian, the title of most dangerous land predator still belongs to the trigonotarbids and their fellow arachnids. Let us pause here for a moment, and consider the scale of what we have covered. We have moved through roughly 150 million years of geological time, from the Cambrian to the late Devonian, and in that vast span, we have gone from a world with no land animals at all to a world with small predatory arachnids hunting in the leaf litter of the first forests. 150 million years. That is an almost inconceivable amount of time. If the history of the United States were compressed into a single second, 150 million years would be roughly equivalent to 150 days. And in all that time, the most dangerous land predator was a creature the size of a large beetle. This puts things in perspective. The great predators that we associate with the deep past, the towering dinosaurs and massive mammals, came much later in the story. The early history of terrestrial predation is a story of small creatures in a small world, a world that was still being built, ecosystem by ecosystem, species by species. The stage was being set, but the great actors had not yet arrived. But they were coming. And the next period in Earth's history would produce predators on a scale that the Devonian world could never have imagined. The Carboniferous period spans from approximately 359 to 299 million years ago, and it is one of the most remarkable and visually stunning periods in all of Earth's history. The name Carboniferous means coal-bearing, and it refers to the vast deposits of coal that formed during this period, the fossilized remains of the immense swamp forests that covered large portions of the equatorial regions. These forests, and the unique atmospheric conditions that accompanied them, created an environment unlike anything the planet has seen before or since, and they produced some of the most extraordinary creatures in the history of life. To understand the Carboniferous, you have to understand what the world looked like. The continents were in the process of colliding to form the supercontinent of Pangaea. The equatorial regions were dominated by enormous, swampy lowlands, covered in dense forests of towering trees. But these were not the trees we know today. They were lycopsids, giant club mosses with names like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, that could reach heights of 40 meters or more. Their trunks were covered in distinctive diamond-shaped leaf scars, and they grew in dense, cathedral-like stands, their canopies forming a high, green ceiling above the dark, waterlogged forest floor. Beneath the canopy, the Carboniferous coal swamps were a world of shadows and moisture. The ground was a thick mat of fallen vegetation, slowly decomposing in the warm, humid conditions. Ferns and horsetails grew in thick profusion, some of them reaching tree-like proportions themselves. Pools of standing water dotted the landscape, home to fish, amphibians, and a variety of aquatic invertebrates. But the most remarkable feature of the Carboniferous world was its atmosphere. The oxygen content of the air was significantly higher than it is today. Modern atmospheric oxygen is approximately 21%. During the Carboniferous, it may have been as high as 35%, perhaps even higher. This hyperoxic atmosphere had profound effects on the organisms that lived in it, particularly the arthropods. Arthropods breathe through a system of tiny tubes called tracheae, which carry air directly from the surface of the body to the internal tissues. This system is efficient at small body sizes, but it becomes increasingly less efficient as the animal grows larger. In larger arthropods, the tracheae have to be longer, and the diffusion of oxygen through these longer tubes becomes the limiting factor on body size. In the modern atmosphere, with 21% oxygen, this limits most terrestrial arthropods to relatively small sizes. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, the world's land-dwelling arthropods are measured in centimeters, not meters. In the Carboniferous, with its enriched oxygen levels, this constraint was relaxed. More oxygen in the air meant that oxygen could diffuse through longer tracheae more efficiently, which meant that arthropods could grow larger. Much larger. And grow larger they did. The Carboniferous is famous for its giant arthropods. Meganeura, a dragonfly relative with a wingspan of over 70 centimeters, nearly 2.5 feet, cruised through the forest canopy, hunting other insects on the wing. Arthropleura, a giant millipede that could reach lengths of over 2 meters, roughly 6.5 feet, trundled through the leaf litter, probably feeding on decaying plant material. These creatures were enormous by modern arthropod standards, and they owe their extraordinary size to the oxygen-rich atmosphere that surrounded them. But for our story, the most significant giant arthropod of the Carboniferous is a creature that combined large size with aggressive predatory behavior. It is a creature that has haunted the imaginations of paleontologists and the nightmares of arachnophobes for generations. It is the giant scorpion known as Pulmonoscorpius. Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis was discovered in fossils from what is now Scotland, in rocks dating to the early Carboniferous, roughly 336 million years ago. And when we say it was a giant scorpion, we mean it was a genuinely, impressively, disturbingly large scorpion. Estimates of its total body length range from about 70 centimeters to perhaps a full meter, roughly 2 to 3 feet from the tips of its pedipalps to the end of its tail. To put that in perspective, that is about the size of a medium-sized domestic cat. Imagine encountering a scorpion the size of a cat. That is Pulmonoscorpius. This creature was built for predation. Like all scorpions, it had a segmented body divided into a prosoma, the front section bearing the legs and pedipalps, and an opistosoma, the rear section bearing the respiratory organs and the distinctive segmented tail. The pedipalps, the large, pincer-bearing appendages at the front of the body, were robust and powerful, clearly designed for grasping and crushing prey. The tail, or metasoma, curved up and over the body in the characteristic scorpion posture, tipped with a telson, the venomous stinger. Now, we do not know for certain whether Pulmonoscorpius was venomous. The venom glands of scorpions are soft tissue, and they do not fossilize. But given that every known living species of scorpion is venomous, and given that Pulmonoscorpius had a well-developed telson that closely resembles the stingers of modern species, it is extremely likely that this animal possessed venom. Whether that venom was potent enough to incapacitate large prey is another question, but even without venom, the sheer mechanical power of those pedipalps would have been formidable. Pulmonoscorpius had multiple pairs of eyes, including a pair of median eyes on the top of its prosoma and additional lateral eyes along the front edges. Scorpion eyes are not especially sharp by the standards of insects or vertebrates, but they are sensitive to light and movement, and they would have been adequate for detecting prey and predators in the dimly lit forest floor environment. What did Pulmonoscorpius eat? We can make reasonable inferences based on its anatomy, its size, and the available prey in its ecosystem. The Carboniferous coal swamps were home to a rich community of invertebrates, insects, millipedes, centipedes, spiders, and other arthropods, as well as various amphibians and early reptiles. A scorpion the size of a cat would have been capable of taking a wide range of prey items. Smaller arthropods would have been easy targets, seized in the pedipalps and stung into submission. But Pulmonoscorpius was large enough that it could also have tackled small vertebrates, including the amphibians and early reptiles that inhabited the same swampy environments. Modern scorpions are ambush predators. They typically sit motionless, concealed in a burrow or under a rock, and wait for prey to wander within striking distance. When prey is detected, the scorpion lunges forward, grasps the prey in its pedipalps, and delivers a sting with its tail. The venom immobilizes the prey, and the scorpion then proceeds to tear it apart with its chelicerae, the small mouthparts located between the pedipalps, and consume it at leisure. There is every reason to believe that Pulmonoscorpius hunted in a similar fashion. The Carboniferous forest floor, with its thick layer of leaf litter and fallen vegetation, would have provided ample opportunities for concealment. A cat-sized scorpion, lurking beneath a layer of dead fern fronds or tucked into a gap between fallen lycopsid trunks, would have been an extraordinarily effective ambush predator. Anything that wandered too close, be it an insect, a small amphibian, or another arthropod, would have been seized and dispatched with brutal efficiency. In its ecosystem, Pulmonoscorpius was almost certainly an apex predator, or very close to one. It was the largest known terrestrial predator of the early Carboniferous. There were larger creatures on land. Arthropleura was longer, for example, but Arthropleura was a herbivore or detritivore, not a predator. Among the animals that actively hunted other animals, Pulmonoscorpius was the biggest and the most dangerous. This represents a dramatic escalation from the Trigonotarbids of the Devonian. In just a few tens of millions of years, we have gone from predators measured in millimeters to predators measured in tens of centimeters. The Trigonotarbids were hunting springtails and mites. Pulmonoscorpius was hunting creatures that were themselves centimeters long, and possibly even small vertebrates. The scale of terrestrial predation had increased enormously, and with it, the complexity and intensity of the terrestrial arms race. But Pulmonoscorpius did not rule the Carboniferous alone. The same oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed scorpions to grow to cat-like proportions also allowed other predatory arthropods to reach impressive sizes. Large centipedes, some possibly reaching lengths of over a foot, prowled the leaf litter. Giant dragonfly relatives hunted in the air. Spiders, though still relatively small compared to their modern relatives, were becoming more diverse and more sophisticated in their predatory strategies. And then there were the vertebrates. The Carboniferous was a critical period in the evolution of terrestrial vertebrates. The early tetrapods of the Devonian, those transitional forms that were still more fish than amphibian, had given rise to a diverse array of amphibians that were now thoroughly adapted to life on land. Some of these Carboniferous amphibians were formidable predators in their own right. Creatures like Crassigyrinus, a large, aquatic predator with powerful jaws and forward-facing eyes, haunted the waterways of the coal swamps. Proterogyrinus and other early tetrapods were becoming increasingly terrestrial, developing stronger limbs and more efficient lungs. But perhaps the most significant vertebrate development of the Carboniferous was the evolution of the amniotic egg. This innovation, which appeared sometime during the early Carboniferous, freed vertebrates from the need to return to water to reproduce. The amniotic egg enclosed the developing embryo in a protective membrane, complete with its own self-contained water supply, allowing it to develop on dry land without desiccating. This was a game-changing adaptation, comparable in its importance to the evolution of vascular tissue in plants. It opened up the interior of the continents to vertebrate colonization, and it set the stage for the evolution of the two great groups of terrestrial vertebrates that would dominate the land for the next 300 million years, the synapsids and the reptiles. The synapsids, which would eventually give rise to mammals, and the reptiles, which would eventually give rise to dinosaurs and birds, both appeared during the Carboniferous. In these early days, the distinction between the two groups was subtle, based on details of skull anatomy that would seem almost trivial to a casual observer. But the divergence between these two lineages would prove to be one of the most consequential splits in the history of vertebrate evolution, leading to two fundamentally different approaches to being a large terrestrial animal. In the Carboniferous itself, these early amniotes were small, lizard-like creatures, typically measuring only a few tens of centimeters in length. They were insectivores and small predators, feeding on the abundant arthropod fauna of the coal swamps. They were not yet the dominant predators of their ecosystems. That role still belonged to the giant arthropods and the large amphibians. But they were evolving rapidly, and their descendants would soon take center stage. Let us dwell a moment longer on the Carboniferous world, because it is genuinely one of the most alien and fascinating environments in Earth's history. Picture yourself standing in a Carboniferous coal swamp. The air is warm and thick with moisture. The oxygen content is so high that you can feel it with every breath, a heady, almost intoxicating richness. The light filtering through the canopy is dim and green, filtered through the fronds of giant ferns and the scale-covered bark of lycopsid trees that tower 40 meters above you. The ground beneath your feet is soft and waterlogged, a thick carpet of decomposing vegetation. You can hear the drip of moisture from the canopy, the buzz of giant insects in the air above, the rustle of something moving through the leaf litter at your feet. And if you look carefully, if you peer into the shadows beneath a fallen log or into the dark recesses of a buttress root, you might see the gleam of light off a curved, segmented tail, and the slow, deliberate movement of pedipalps as a Pulmonoscorpius prepares to strike. This is the world of the Carboniferous apex predator. It is small by later standards, a cat-sized scorpion rather than a bus-sized dinosaur, but it is the most dangerous thing on land at this moment in Earth's history. It rules its world as absolutely as any tyrannosaur would later rule its own. But the Carboniferous world was not destined to last. The conditions that created the coal swamps, the high oxygen levels, the warm, wet climate, the vast lowland forests of lycopsids and ferns, were the product of a specific set of geological and atmospheric circumstances, and those circumstances were changing. As the continents continued their slow collision to form Pangaea, the geography of the planet shifted. Mountain ranges rose as land masses crashed together, altering weather patterns and creating rain shadows. The equatorial lowlands that had supported the coal swamps began to dry out. The climate became more seasonal, with greater temperature extremes and more pronounced wet and dry periods. The great lycopsid forests began to shrink, replaced in many areas by drier, more open habitats dominated by conifers and seed ferns. As the forest shrank, so did the oxygen levels. The Carboniferous had been a period of extraordinary carbon burial, with vast quantities of organic matter being locked away in swamp sediments, eventually forming the coal deposits that give the period its name. This carbon burial had drawn down atmospheric carbon dioxide and boosted oxygen levels to their all-time high. But as the coal swamps disappeared, the rate of carbon burial declined, and atmospheric oxygen began to drop. For the giant arthropods, this was catastrophic. Their enormous size had been made possible by the high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous. As oxygen declined, the tracheorespiratory system that had served them so well became increasingly inadequate for their oversized bodies. Larger species were the most affected, and over time, the giants of the Carboniferous began to shrink or disappear entirely. Pulmonoscorpius and its kin were among the casualties of this environmental shift. The giant scorpions, the massive dragonflies, the enormous millipedes, all of them dwindled as the conditions that had supported their extraordinary size faded away. By the end of the Carboniferous and the beginning of the Permian period, the age of giant arthropod predators was drawing to a close. But as the arthropods receded, the vertebrates advanced. And in the Permian period, the baton of apex terrestrial predation would be passed from the invertebrates to the vertebrates, a transfer that would prove to be permanent. The Permian period, the last period of the Paleozoic era, spans from approximately 299 to 252 million years ago. It is a period of enormous importance in the history of life, not least because it ends with the most devastating mass extinction in Earth's history, an event so catastrophic that it wiped out roughly 90 to 96% of all marine species and roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. We will get to that extinction in due course. But first, let us look at what the Permian world was like before the catastrophe, and at the extraordinary predators that ruled it. The Permian world was dominated by the supercontinent of Pangaea, which by this time had largely assembled. This vast landmass stretched from pole to pole, a single enormous continent surrounded by the global ocean of Panthalassa. The interior of Pangaea was dry, far from the moderating influence of the oceans, subject to extreme temperatures and minimal rainfall. Vast deserts covered much of the continental interior, while the coastal regions supported more diverse ecosystems with forests, wetlands, and river systems. The climate of the Permian was generally warmer than today, though it varied considerably over the period's nearly 50 million year span. The early Permian saw the waning of the Carboniferous glaciations that had affected the southern portions of Gondwana, while the middle and late Permian were characterized by increasingly warm and dry conditions. In this world, the synapsids came into their own. Remember the synapsids, those small, lizard-like creatures that had evolved alongside the first reptiles in the Carboniferous? By the Permian, they had diversified into an extraordinary array of forms, ranging from small, agile insectivores to massive, slow-moving herbivores to towering, predatory monsters. The synapsids were the dominant terrestrial vertebrates of the Permian, and they held this position for tens of millions of years. The synapsids are sometimes informally called mammal-like reptiles, a term that is misleading but conveys the basic idea. They are not reptiles. They are the evolutionary lineage that would eventually produce mammals, including us. But in the Permian, they looked nothing like modern mammals. They were scaly, cold-blooded or partially warm-blooded, and their body plans were often closer to those of reptiles than to those of furry, four-legged creatures. The mammalian features that we take for granted, things like fur, milk, specialized teeth, and fully upright posture, would not evolve until much later in the synapsid lineage. The Permian synapsids are divided into two major groups, the pelycosaurs, which dominated the early Permian, and the therapsids, which dominated the middle and late Permian. The pelycosaurs included famous creatures like Dimetrodon, the sail-backed predator that is often mistakenly identified as a dinosaur. Dimetrodon was a formidable predator, reaching lengths of over 3 meters, with a large skull armed with differentiated teeth, including prominent canines, that were well suited for seizing and processing prey. But Dimetrodon, impressive as it was a creature of the early Permian. As the period progressed, the pelycosaurs gave way to the therapsids, a more advanced group of synapsids that displayed an increasingly mammal-like suite of characteristics. The therapsids were more active, more metabolically efficient, and in many cases, more predatory than their pelycosaur predecessors. Among the therapsids, one group stands out as the ultimate expression of Permian predatory power. These are the dinocephalians, the terrible heads, and the most formidable of all the dinocephalians was the terrifying Anteosaurus. Anteosaurus magnificus. Even the name carries weight. This was an animal that lived during the Middle Permian, roughly 260 to 265 million years ago, in what is now southern Africa. It was the apex predator of its ecosystem, and by the standards of its time, it was a colossus. Anteosaurus was a massive animal. Estimates of its total body length range from about 5 to 6 meters, roughly 16 to 20 feet. Its weight has been estimated at 500 to 600 kilograms, comparable to a large Kodiak bear. This made it one of the largest terrestrial predators that had existed up to that point in Earth's history, and by far the largest terrestrial predator of the Permian. The skull of Anteosaurus was enormous and heavily built, roughly 80 centimeters long, about 2.5 feet. It was thick and solid, with massive bones and prominent bosses, rounded bony protuberances, on the forehead and above the eyes. These bosses have led some paleontologists to suggest that Anteosaurus may have engaged in headbutting contests, like modern musk oxen or bighorn sheep, perhaps as part of territorial disputes or mating displays. Whether or not this is the case, the reinforced skull structure certainly suggests that the animal's head was subject to significant physical stress during its lifetime. The jaws of Anteosaurus were armed with large, interlocking teeth, including prominent incisors at the front and larger, canine-like teeth further back. These teeth were designed for seizing and holding struggling prey, and the jaw muscles, which attached to the broad, flaring zygomatic arches of the skull, were powerful enough to deliver a devastating bite. The body of Anteosaurus was bulky and powerfully built, supported by 4 stout limbs. Like most synapsids of its era, Anteosaurus had a sprawling gait, with its limbs extended out to the sides rather than tucked directly beneath the body in the manner of modern mammals. This sprawling posture was less mechanically efficient for sustained locomotion than the upright posture of later mammals, and it suggests that Anteosaurus was probably not a long-distance pursuit predator. Instead, it likely relied on short bursts of speed and brute force to overpower its prey. And its prey? Anteosaurus lived alongside a variety of other large therapsids, including the massive, herbivorous tapinocephalids, creatures like Moe's chops that could weigh well over a ton. These lumbering herbivores, with their barrel-shaped bodies and thick skulls, were the primary large herbivores of the Middle Permian, and they would have been the natural prey of a predator of Anteosaurus's size and power. Recent research has shed new light on the hunting capabilities of Anteosaurus. A detailed study of its inner ear structure, published in the journal Acta Paleontologica Polonica, revealed that Anteosaurus had a relatively large and well-developed vestibular system, the part of the inner ear that controls balance and spatial orientation. This suggests that Anteosaurus was more agile and more coordinated than its heavy build might suggest. The researchers concluded that Anteosaurus was probably an active predator, capable of rapid movements and quick directional changes, rather than a slow, plodding scavenger. Furthermore, analysis of the brain cavity of Anteosaurus suggests that it had a relatively large brain for a dinocephalian, with well-developed regions associated with motor control and sensory processing. This animal was not just big and strong. It was, by the standards of its contemporaries, relatively smart and relatively agile. It was a hunter, not a mere brute. To encounter Anteosaurus in the Middle Permian would have been a genuinely terrifying experience. Imagine a creature the size and weight of a grizzly bear, but with the skull of a crocodile and the sprawling, low-slung posture of a giant lizard, bursting from ambush with a speed and ferocity that belied its bulky frame. Its jaws would close on its victim with crushing force, the interlocking teeth preventing any escape. The prey animal, whether a half-ton Moe's chops or a smaller therapsid, would be brought down by sheer physical power and held in place until it stopped struggling. Anteosaurus represents a quantum leap in the evolution of terrestrial predation. We have gone from cat-sized scorpions in the Carboniferous to bear-sized synapsids in the Permian, an increase in predator body mass of roughly 3 orders of magnitude. The arms race between predators and prey has escalated dramatically, and the scale of violence on the Permian landscape is incomparably greater than anything that had come before. But Anteosaurus and the other dinocephalians were not destined to rule forever. The Middle Permian saw a significant extinction event, sometimes called the Capitanian extinction or the Olson's extinction, which decimated the dinocephalian fauna. The causes of this extinction are debated, but volcanic activity, climate change, and ecosystem restructuring have all been proposed as contributing factors. Anteosaurus and its close relatives disappear from the fossil record after this event, replaced by a new caste of therapsids, including the Gorgonopsians, a group of saber-toothed predators that would dominate the late Permian. The Gorgonopsians were, in many ways, even more specialized predators than the dinocephalians. They had narrower skulls, longer canine teeth, and more upright postures, suggesting a more active, pursuit-oriented hunting style. The largest Gorgonopsians, like Inostrancevia, could reach lengths of 3 meters or more and were armed with saber-like canine teeth that could have inflicted devastating slashing wounds on their prey. They were terrifying animals, the wolves and lions of the late Permian world, and they ruled the terrestrial food web right up until the end of the period. And then came the end. The end Permian mass extinction, also known as the Great Dying, occurred approximately 252 million years ago, and it was the most catastrophic biological crisis in the history of life on Earth. Nothing else comes close. Not the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Not the end Ordovician glaciation. Not any of the other major extinctions that punctuate the fossil record. The Great Dying stands alone in its sheer, overwhelming devastation. The cause of the extinction was almost certainly the eruption of the Siberian Traps, an immense volcanic province that covered millions of square kilometers with lava flows and released staggering quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. The resulting environmental disruption, including extreme global warming, ocean acidification, widespread anoxia, and possibly ozone depletion, pushed both marine and terrestrial ecosystems to the breaking point. In the oceans, the effect was apocalyptic. Roughly 90 to 96% of all marine species went extinct. Coral reefs vanished. Trilobites, which had survived every previous extinction event for nearly 300 million years, were finally wiped out. The oceans became stagnant, anoxic death zones, inhospitable to almost all complex life. On land, the devastation was nearly as severe. Roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. The great therapsid dynasties of the Permian were decimated. The Gorgonopsians, those magnificent saber-toothed predators, went completely extinct. The diverse communities of herbivorous therapsids were reduced to a handful of surviving lineages. The forests were stripped away, replaced by vast expanses of bare ground and fungal blooms as the decomposers feasted on the dead. The Great Dying drew a line across the history of life. Everything before it belongs to the Paleozoic era, the era of ancient life. Everything after it belongs to the Mesozoic era, the era of middle life, the era that most people know as the Age of Dinosaurs. When the dust settled and the lava cooled and the atmosphere slowly began to stabilize, the survivors emerged into a devastated, empty world. The terrestrial ecosystems of the Permian had been shattered. The complex food webs that had taken tens of millions of years to develop were gone. The dominant predators were gone. The dominant herbivores were gone. The world was a blank page, waiting to be written upon. And writing upon that page, in letters of claw and fang and blood, would be a new caste of predators that would grow to sizes never before seen on land. The Age of Dinosaurs was about to begin. But the dinosaurs did not inherit the Earth immediately. The Triassic period, which spans from approximately 252 to 201 million years ago, is a period of recovery and transition. The devastated ecosystems of the post-extinction world rebuilt themselves slowly, and the animals that came to dominate the Triassic were not always the ones that would dominate the subsequent periods. The early Triassic was a grim time. Global temperatures remained elevated for millions of years after the end Permian extinction, and large portions of the continents were arid, desolate wastelands. The surviving terrestrial vertebrates were mostly small, generalized creatures, eking out an existence in a world that had been stripped of most of its ecological complexity. The once dominant synapsids were reduced to a shadow of their former diversity, though some lineages, particularly the Dicynodonts, a group of herbivorous therapsids, survived and even thrived for a time. But the most significant development of the Triassic was the rise of the Archosaurs. The Archosaurs are a group of reptiles that includes two major lineages, the Pseudopsuchians, which include the crocodilians and their relatives, and the Avimetatarsalians, which include the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and birds. Both lineages appeared during the early Triassic, and both diversified rapidly as the world recovered from the Great Dying. In the early and middle Triassic, it was the Pseudopsuchians, the crocodilian relatives, that dominated the terrestrial ecosystems. These were not the semi-aquatic, ambush predators that we associate with modern crocodiles. Many Triassic Pseudopsuchians were fully terrestrial, with upright postures, long legs, and active, predatory lifestyles. They came in a bewildering variety of forms, from small, agile bipedal runners to massive, heavily armored quadrupeds. And among all the Triassic Pseudopsuchians, one stands out as the most formidable land predator of its era. This is Phaseolacicus, a creature so large and so powerful that it dwarfs everything else on the Triassic landscape. Phaseolacicus tenax lived during the late Triassic, roughly 220 to 210 million years ago, in what is now South America. It was a Rawasuchian, a member of one of the most successful groups of Triassic Pseudopsuchians, characterized by their large size, upright posture, and predatory habits. When we say Phaseolacicus was large, we mean it was genuinely enormous. Estimates of its total body length range from 8 to 10 meters, roughly 26 to 33 feet. This makes it one of the largest non-dinosaur terrestrial predators in Earth's history. Its weight has been estimated at several hundred kilograms, possibly approaching or exceeding 1 metric ton. To put that in perspective, Phaseolacicus was roughly the same length as a modern city bus and weighed as much as a small car. Phaseolacicus walked on 4 legs, with its limbs positioned beneath its body in an upright, pillar-like posture similar to that of dinosaurs and modern mammals, rather than the sprawling posture of most modern reptiles. This upright posture was mechanically efficient, allowing Phaseolacicus to support its enormous weight and to move with a degree of speed and agility that would have been impossible with a sprawling gait. It was, by the standards of its time, a surprisingly efficient and mobile predator for its size. The skull of Phaseolacicus was large, deep, and heavily constructed, with powerful jaw muscles and teeth designed for seizing and processing large prey. Unfortunately, the fossil material of Phaseolacicus is incomplete, and we do not have a perfectly preserved skull. But based on comparisons with closely related Rawasuchians whose skulls are better known, we can infer that Phaseolacicus had a deep, narrow snout with large, serrated teeth, a configuration well suited for delivering powerful bites to large prey animals. Along its back, Phaseolacicus bore a row of osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin that served as armor. These osteoderms were a common feature of Pseudopsuchians, and they would have provided significant protection against the attacks of other predators or the defensive weapons of prey animals. A creature that needed armor suggests a world where violence was common, and where even the apex predator was not immune to injury. What did Phaseolacicus hunt? The late Triassic ecosystems in which it lived were home to a variety of large herbivores, including the last of the Dicynodonts, various large archosauromorphs, and the earliest true dinosaurs. Some of the large herbivorous dinosaurs of the late Triassic, like the sauropodomorphs, which were the ancestors of the giant, long-necked sauropods of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, would have been potential prey for a predator of Phaseolacicus's size. The late Triassic was, in many ways, a strange and transitional world. Dinosaurs had already appeared, and some of them were already significant predators in their own right. Heterosaurus, one of the earliest known predatory dinosaurs, was a fast, agile bipedal hunter that could reach lengths of about 6 meters. Coelophysis, another early theropod, was smaller but extremely numerous, and it was probably one of the most common predators in many late Triassic ecosystems. But despite the presence of these early dinosaurs, it was the Pseudopsuchians like Phaseolacicus that held the title of apex predator. The early dinosaurs were fast and agile, but they were generally smaller than the largest Pseudopsuchians, and they had not yet evolved the massive body sizes and powerful weaponry that would characterize the great theropod predators of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Phaseolacicus, then, represents the peak of Pseudosuchian predatory evolution. It was the last and greatest of the great four-legged predators that had dominated the Triassic landscape, a biological empire builder whose lineage had ruled the land for millions of years. In a world where the dinosaurs were still upstarts, still finding their footing, Phaseolacicus was the established king. But the reign of the Pseudosuchians was drawing to a close. The End-Triassic extinction event, which occurred approximately 201 million years ago, struck with devastating force. Volcanic eruptions associated with the breakup of Pangaea released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, triggering rapid climate change and environmental disruption. Marine and terrestrial ecosystems were severely affected, and many groups of organisms were driven to extinction. Among the casualties were the Rauisuchians. Phaseolacicus and its relatives disappeared from the fossil record at the end of the Triassic, victims of an environmental catastrophe that fundamentally reshuffled the terrestrial fauna. The Pseudosuchians as a whole survived, but in greatly reduced form. The only Pseudosuchian lineage that persisted through the extinction and into the Jurassic was the one that had adopted a semi-aquatic lifestyle, the ancestors of modern crocodilians. The great terrestrial Pseudosuchian predators were gone. And into the ecological vacuum left by their disappearance, the dinosaurs expanded. Freed from competition with the Rauisuchians and other large Pseudosuchians, the dinosaurs diversified rapidly in the earliest Jurassic, filling ecological niches that had been vacated by the extinction. Within just a few million years of the End-Triassic event, dinosaurs had become the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates on every continent. They would hold this position for the next 135 million years. The Jurassic period, spanning from approximately 201 to 145 million years ago, is one of the most iconic periods in the history of life. This is the period of the great sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked giants that are among the largest animals ever to walk the earth. It is the period when dinosaur diversity exploded, when the theropods, the carnivorous bipedal dinosaurs, evolved into a dazzling array of predatory forms. And it is the period when two of the most famous theropod predators in paleontological history competed for supremacy. The Jurassic world was very different from the modern world, but in many ways, it was more familiar than the alien landscapes of the Paleozoic. Pangaea was breaking up, splitting into the northern supercontinent of Laurasia and the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, with the Tethys Sea opening between them. The climate was warm and humid, with no polar ice caps and sea levels significantly higher than today. The continents were covered in lush vegetation, including conifers, ferns, cycads, and ginkgos, though flowering plants had not yet evolved. The ecosystems of the Jurassic were dominated by dinosaurs. Enormous sauropods, creatures like Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, and Apatosaurus, roamed the landscape in herds, their long necks reaching high into the tree canopy to feed on the topmost foliage. Stegosaurs, with their distinctive rows of dorsal plates and tail spikes, grazed on lower-growing vegetation. Smaller ornithischian dinosaurs filled various herbivorous niches, while mammals, still tiny and mostly nocturnal, scurried through the underbrush. And stalking through this world, hunting the herbivores with ruthless efficiency, were the great theropod predators. Among the most famous and best-studied Jurassic theropods are Allosaurus and Torvosaurus, two massive predators that coexisted in the same ecosystems during the late Jurassic, roughly 150 to 145 million years ago. These two animals are so closely matched in their predatory capabilities that many paleontologists consider them to be coapex predators, sharing the top of the food chain in a way that is unusual but not unprecedented in the history of life. Allosaurus fragilis is one of the most iconic predatory dinosaurs in popular culture. It was a large, bipedal theropod, reaching lengths of 8 to 12 meters, roughly 26 to 40 feet, depending on the individual. Its weight has been estimated at 1 to 2 metric tons. Allosaurus had a large, narrow skull with prominent brow horns, a long, muscular tail, and powerful hind limbs designed for bipedal locomotion. Its forelimbs were relatively short but muscular, armed with 3 curved, sharp claws on each hand. The skull of Allosaurus is a masterpiece of predatory engineering. It was lightly built relative to its size, with large fenestrae, the openings in the skull that reduce weight, while maintaining structural integrity. The jaw was lined with dozens of serrated, blade-like teeth, each one curved backward to prevent prey from pulling free. But what makes the Allosaurus skull truly remarkable is the way it was designed to function during a kill. Biomechanical analyses of Allosaurus skulls have revealed that the skull was not optimized for a powerful, crushing bite like that of later predators. Instead, it was designed for a different kind of attack. The upper jaw could flex slightly relative to the rest of the skull, and the head was attached to the neck by powerful muscles that allowed it to be driven downward with tremendous force. Researchers have proposed that Allosaurus used its head like a hatchet, driving its upper jaw down into the flesh of its prey with a powerful, slashing motion, tearing out chunks of meat with each strike. This hatchet attack strategy would have been devastatingly effective against the large sauropod dinosaurs that dominated the Jurassic landscape. A sauropod like Diplodocus, with its long neck and massive body, was far too large for any predator to bring down with a single bite. But a series of rapid, slashing attacks, each one tearing away a piece of flesh and opening a bleeding wound, could have weakened and eventually killed even the largest prey. The strategy is similar to that used by some modern predators, like Komodo dragons, which deliver slashing bites and then follow their wounded prey until blood loss and infection bring it down. Allosaurus was also a social animal, or at least, there is evidence to suggest that it sometimes hunted in groups. Several localities have yielded multiple Allosaurus specimens preserved together, which some paleontologists interpret as evidence of pack hunting. If Allosaurus did hunt in groups, this would have made it an even more formidable predator, capable of coordinating attacks on prey animals much larger than any individual could have taken alone. Torvosaurus, the other contender for Jurassic apex predator, was a different kind of animal. It belonged to the Megalosauridae, a separate lineage of large theropods that evolved independently from the Allosaurid lineage. Torvosaurus was roughly comparable to Allosaurus in size, with some estimates suggesting it may have been slightly larger, reaching lengths of 10 to 11 meters, roughly 33 to 36 feet, and weights of perhaps 2 metric tons or more. Where Allosaurus had a lightly built skull optimized for slashing attacks, Torvosaurus had a more robustly constructed skull with a deeper snout and stronger jaw muscles. Its teeth, while still serrated and blade-like, were generally larger and more robust than those of Allosaurus, suggesting a more powerful bite. Some paleontologists have interpreted these differences as evidence that Torvosaurus had a different hunting strategy than Allosaurus, perhaps relying more on powerful, bone-crunching bites and less on the slashing, hatchet-style attacks used by its contemporary. Torvosaurus also had exceptionally powerful forelimbs. The humerus, the upper arm bone, of Torvosaurus is one of the most massive known from any theropod dinosaur relative to its body size. These powerful arms, armed with large, curved claws, would have been formidable weapons, capable of grasping and restraining prey while the jaws did their work. The coexistence of Allosaurus and Torvosaurus in the same ecosystem raises fascinating questions about ecological partitioning and competition. How did two such large, predatory animals share the same landscape without driving each other to extinction? The answer almost certainly lies in niche partitioning, the ecological principle that competing species can coexist if they exploit slightly different resources or microhabitats. It is possible that Allosaurus and Torvosaurus targeted different prey species, or different age classes of the same species. Perhaps Allosaurus, with its more agile build and slashing attack style, specialized in hunting the faster, more mobile herbivores, while Torvosaurus, with its more powerful build and stronger bite, focused on larger, slower prey. Or perhaps they hunted in different habitats within the same ecosystem, with one preferring open floodplains and the other preferring forested environments. The fossil record does not give us a definitive answer, but the coexistence of these two magnificent predators speaks to the richness and complexity of the late Jurassic ecosystem. Together, Allosaurus and Torvosaurus represent the pinnacle of Jurassic predatory evolution. They were among the largest and most powerful land predators that had ever existed, surpassed only by the truly colossal theropods that would evolve in the subsequent period. They ruled their world for millions of years, sitting atop a food chain that stretched from the tiniest insects to the mightiest sauropods. They were the terror of the Jurassic landscape, and no prey animal was safe from their attention. But even these magnificent predators were destined to be surpassed. Because the Cretaceous period was coming, and with it would come the greatest, most powerful, most terrifying terrestrial predator in the entire history of life on Earth. A predator that needs no introduction but deserves one anyway. The Cretaceous period is the last and longest period of the Mesozoic era, spanning from approximately 145 to 66 million years ago. It was a time of extraordinary biological diversity, remarkable evolutionary innovation, and, at its very end, devastating catastrophe. The Cretaceous saw the evolution and diversification of flowering plants, which would eventually come to dominate terrestrial vegetation. It saw the diversification of mammals, still small and generally nocturnal, but increasingly diverse in their ecological roles. It saw the evolution of birds from small, feathered theropod dinosaurs, a transformation that represents one of the most remarkable evolutionary transitions in the history of vertebrate life. And it saw the evolution of the tyrannosaurs. The tyrannosaurs are a family of large theropod dinosaurs that first appeared during the Middle Cretaceous and reached their peak of diversity and size during the very late Cretaceous, roughly 70 to 66 million years ago. The family includes several impressive species, from the slender, fleet-footed Albertosaurus to the massive, bone-crushing Tarbosaurus. But one species stands above all the others, a creature that has become the most famous predator in the history of paleontology, a cultural icon, a symbol of prehistoric power and ferocity. Tyrannosaurus rex. The tyrant lizard king. There is no predator in the history of life on Earth that combines the same extraordinary set of attributes that Tyrannosaurus rex possessed. It was one of the largest terrestrial predators that ever lived. It had the most powerful bite of any land animal in the history of the planet. It was, by the standards of its contemporaries and perhaps by any standard, remarkably intelligent. And it lived at the very end of the dinosaur era, the culmination of 160 million years of theropod evolution, the final and greatest expression of a predatory lineage that had been honing its craft since the Triassic. Let us begin with the numbers, because the numbers alone are staggering. Tyrannosaurus rex was approximately 12 to 13 meters long, roughly 40 to 43 feet. Some specimens may have been slightly larger. It stood approximately 4 meters tall at the hip, roughly 13 feet, and when it raised its head to its full height, its eyes would have been 5 to 6 meters, 16 to 20 feet, above the ground. Its weight has been estimated at 7 to 9 metric tons, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 pounds, comparable to the weight of an African bull elephant. But raw size alone does not make a predator. What made T. rex truly exceptional was the combination of size with an extraordinary set of biological weapons. The skull of Tyrannosaurus rex was enormous, up to 1.5 meters long, roughly 5 feet, and massively constructed. Unlike the lightly built skulls of allosaurids, the Tyrannosaur's skull was a fortress of bone, with thick, reinforced walls and relatively small fenestrae. The jaw muscles were immense, attached to broad, flaring temporal arches that gave the skull its characteristic wide, powerful appearance. And those jaw muscles drove a bite that was, quite simply, without equal in the history of terrestrial vertebrates. Biomechanical models, based on the size and geometry of the skull and jaw muscles, have estimated the bite force of Tyrannosaurus rex at roughly 35,000 to 57,000 newtons. To translate that into more intuitive terms, T. rex could exert a force of approximately 7,800 to 12,800 pounds per square inch at the tips of its teeth. This is roughly 10 times the bite force of a modern saltwater crocodile, which itself has the most powerful bite of any living animal. But bite force alone is only part of the story. The teeth of Tyrannosaurus rex were uniquely designed to maximize the destructive power of that bite. Unlike the blade-like, slicing teeth of allosaurs, the teeth of T. rex were thick, conical, and robust, shaped more like railroad spikes than steak knives. These teeth were not designed to slice through flesh. They were designed to punch through bone. And that is exactly what they did. The fossil record preserves direct evidence of the bone-crushing power of T. rex. Hadrosaur bones, ceratopsian bones, even the bones of other tyrannosaurs, have been found with deep, puncture-like bite marks that match the tooth dimensions of Tyrannosaurus rex. In some cases, the bones have been bitten clean through. In other cases, healed bite marks show that the prey animal survived an initial attack, only to bear the scars for the rest of its life. Perhaps most dramatically, fossilized Tyrannosaur coprolites, preserved feces, have been found to contain large fragments of crushed bone. This tells us that T. rex did not just kill its prey. It consumed the bones as well, crushing them with its jaws and digesting them for their nutritional content. This is a behavior seen in some modern hyenas and crocodilians, but at a scale that dwarfs anything in the modern world. The arms of Tyrannosaurus rex are famously small, and they have been the subject of much discussion and not a little mockery. Each arm was only about 1 meter long, roughly 3 feet, which looks absurdly diminutive on an animal of T. rex's overall size. Why would such a powerful predator have such tiny arms? The answer, or at least the most widely accepted explanation, is that T. rex did not need large arms. Its primary weapon was its head. The skull, the jaws, and the teeth did all the work. The arms may have had some ancillary function, perhaps helping the animal rise from a prone position, or perhaps playing a role in mating behavior, but they were not significant weapons. The entire predatory strategy of T. rex was centered on its skull. Everything else was secondary. But there is another aspect of Tyrannosaurus rex that is often overlooked in popular accounts, an aspect that may be even more remarkable than its size or its bite force. And that is its brain. The brain of T. rex was, by reptilian standards, enormous. CT scans of tyrannosaur skulls have revealed that the brain was roughly the size and shape of a large grapefruit, much larger relative to body size than the brains of most other dinosaurs. The olfactory bulbs, the parts of the brain responsible for processing smell, were particularly large, suggesting that T. rex had an exceptionally keen sense of smell. The optic lobes were also well developed, indicating good vision, and the cerebrum, the part of the brain associated with higher cognitive functions, was larger and more complex than in most other theropods. Recent research has gone even further, suggesting that T. rex may have been significantly more intelligent than previously thought. A controversial but intriguing study published in 2023 estimated the number of neurons in the brain of T. rex based on comparisons with modern birds and reptiles. The results suggested that T. rex may have had a neuron count comparable to that of a modern baboon, implying cognitive abilities far beyond what we typically attribute to reptiles. Now, this study has been debated and its conclusions are not universally accepted. But even the more conservative estimates of T. rex intelligence suggest an animal that was far from a mindless killing machine. T. rex could see well, hear well, and smell extraordinarily well. It could probably learn from experience, remember the locations of food sources and watering holes, and possibly even recognize individual members of its own species. Some researchers have speculated that T. rex may have been a social animal, hunting in family groups or loose packs. The evidence for this is circumstantial but suggestive. Several sites have yielded multiple tyrannosaur specimens preserved together, and trackway evidence from some locations suggests that tyrannosaurs may have traveled in groups. If T. rex did hunt in packs, even small family groups, the implications are staggering. A coordinated pack of animals, each one 12 meters long and weighing 8 tons, with the most powerful bite of any land animal in history, would have been essentially unstoppable. Tyrannosaurus rex lived during the very end of the Cretaceous period, in the last few million years before the asteroid impact that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. Its range covered a vast territory across western portions of the ancient continent of Laramidia, and it preyed on some of the most heavily defended herbivores in the history of life, the ceratopsians like Triceratops, with their massive bony frills and 3 long horns, and the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs that traveled in enormous herds. The confrontation between Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops is one of the most iconic predator-prey matchups in the history of life. Triceratops was itself a formidable animal, weighing up to 9 metric tons and armed with 3 horns, 1 on the snout and 2 above the eyes, that could reach lengths of over a meter. Its massive frill, a sheet of solid bone extending backward from the skull, protected its neck from attack. Engaging a healthy, adult Triceratops in direct combat was not a trivial undertaking, even for a predator as powerful as T. rex. The fossil evidence tells us that these confrontations did happen, and they were violent. Triceratops bones have been found with tyrannosaur bite marks, and tyrannosaur bones have been found with injuries consistent with horn wounds. These were not gentle encounters. They were battles between two of the most powerful animals that ever walked the earth, and either combatant could be maimed or killed. Tyrannosaurus rex is, by virtually any measure, the greatest terrestrial predator in the history of life. No other land animal has combined its size, its weaponry, its sensory capabilities, and its apparent intelligence in a single package. It was the culmination of a predatory lineage that stretched back to the small, agile theropods of the Triassic, the end product of 160 million years of evolutionary refinement. It was, in a very real sense, the ultimate predator. And then, 66 million years ago, an asteroid approximately 10 kilometers in diameter struck the Earth, and the world changed forever. The Chicxulub impact, named after the crater it left beneath the modern Gulf of Mexico, released energy equivalent to roughly 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The immediate effects included massive firestorms, earthquakes of unimaginable magnitude, and a tsunami that scoured the coastlines of every continent. But it was the long-term effects that proved truly devastating. The impact ejected billions of tons of dust, soot, and sulfur aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging the planet into a prolonged period of darkness and cold, sometimes called an impact winter. Photosynthesis ceased. Plant communities collapsed. The food chains that supported the dinosaurs, from the smallest herbivore to the mightiest tyrannosaur, fell apart. Within decades, perhaps within years, every non-avian dinosaur on the planet was dead. Tyrannosaurus rex, the greatest predator the world had ever known, was gone. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs marks the end of the Mesozoic era and the beginning of the Cenozoic, the era in which we live. And the Cenozoic would bring its own roster of apex predators, animals that rose to fill the ecological vacuums left by the dinosaurs. But those predators belong to the next part of our story. For now, we pause at the boundary between two worlds. Behind us lies the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs, a world of titanic predators and epic ecological dramas played out over 186 million years. Ahead of us lies the Cenozoic, the age of mammals, a world that is recognizably our own but populated by creatures that are in many ways just as strange and just as terrifying as the dinosaurs they replaced. The story of the greatest land predators is far from over. In the next part, we will explore the rise of the mammals, the emergence of new kinds of predators in the wake of the dinosaur extinction, and the extraordinary animals that ruled the earth in the millions of years before our own species appeared. From land crocodiles with hooves to bears the size of horses, the Cenozoic has its own nightmares to offer. But that is for the next part. For now, let us reflect on what we have seen so far. We began in a world without land animals, a world where the continents were bare rock and the only life was in the sea. We watched as the first tiny arthropods crept onto shore, as the first primitive plants began to green the land, as the first trigonotarbids became the first terrestrial predators. We saw the giant scorpions of the Carboniferous, the saber-toothed synapsids of the Permian, the colossal pseudosuchians of the Triassic. We witnessed the rise of the dinosaurs and the evolution of the mightiest theropods, from the slashing Allosaurus to the bone-crushing Tyrannosaurus rex. This is a story of escalation. Each new era brought predators that were larger, more powerful, more sophisticated, and more dangerous than those that came before. The arms race between predators and prey drove the evolution of ever more extreme adaptations, from the venom-tipped tails of giant scorpions to the bone-shattering jaws of tyrannosaurs. It is a story that spans 400 million years, and it is written in every fossil, every trackway, every tooth mark and every bone. And it is a story that continues. Because even after the asteroid struck, even after the Tyrannosaurs fell, the predators did not disappear. They merely changed form. New bodies, new weapons, new strategies, but the same fundamental imperative that has driven terrestrial predation since the first trigonotarbid seized its first springtail in the leaf litter of a Devonian forest. Kill or be killed. Hunt or starve. Adapt or die. That is the law of the land, and it has been the law for as long as there has been life upon it. We left our story at one of the most dramatic moments in the entire history of life on Earth. The asteroid had fallen. The skies had darkened. The Tyrannosaurs, those magnificent bone-crushing monarchs of the late Cretaceous, had been swept from the face of the planet along with every other non-avian dinosaur. The greatest predatory dynasty in terrestrial history was over, extinguished in a geological instant by a catastrophe so severe that it fundamentally reorganized the living world. But nature abhors a vacuum. And in the smoldering, recovering world of the early Cenozoic era, a world stripped of its dinosaurian dominance, something was waiting to fill the void. Something that had been biding its time in the shadows for over 160 million years. Small, warm-blooded, furry, mostly nocturnal, occupying the ecological margins of a world dominated by giants. The mammals were about to inherit the Earth. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To truly appreciate what happened after the asteroid strike, we need to understand the state of the world in the immediate aftermath of the Chicxulub impact. The extinction event that ended the Cretaceous was not a clean, surgical removal of one group of animals followed by an orderly replacement by another. It was a catastrophic, chaotic, devastating collapse of ecological systems that had taken tens of millions of years to develop. And the recovery from that collapse was slow, messy, and filled with evolutionary experiments, some successful, many not. The early Paleogene, the first subdivision of the Cenozoic era, was a world in the process of rebuilding. The plant communities that had been obliterated by the impact winter gradually recovered, though their composition changed significantly. Many of the dominant Cretaceous plant groups were replaced by new species, particularly the flowering plants, the angiosperms, which had already been diversifying during the Cretaceous and now exploded in diversity and abundance in the post-extinction world. Forests regrew. Grasslands began to develop in open areas. The world greened again, slowly and unevenly, over thousands and tens of thousands of years. And as the plants recovered, the animals followed. The survivors of the extinction event, the small mammals, the birds, the lizards and snakes, the crocodilians, the turtles, found themselves in a world with vast quantities of food and almost no competition from the large animals that had previously dominated every significant ecological niche. This was an evolutionary opportunity on a scale that is difficult to overstate. The mammals, in particular, responded to this opportunity with breathtaking speed. From a starting point of small, generalized creatures, mostly weighing less than a kilogram and occupying insectivore and small omnivore niches, the mammals diversified explosively in the early Paleogene. Within just a few million years of the extinction event, mammals had evolved to fill ecological roles as large herbivores, large omnivores, and inevitably, large predators. The diversification of mammals in the early Cenozoic is one of the most dramatic adaptive radiations in the history of life, comparable in its scope and speed to the Cambrian explosion or the post-Permian recovery. But here is something that most popular accounts of this period tend to overlook. In the immediate aftermath of the dinosaur extinction, the ecological vacuum was not filled exclusively by mammals. Other groups of animals also seized the opportunity, and some of them evolved into predators of formidable size and ferocity. In fact, some of the most dangerous predators of the early Cenozoic were not mammals at all. They were reptiles. And one group of reptiles in particular would evolve a predatory form so remarkable, so unexpected, so completely at odds with our modern understanding of what these animals should be, that it challenges every assumption we might bring to the story of terrestrial predation. They were the land crocodiles. And they were among the most extraordinary predators in the history of the Cenozoic era. To understand the land crocodiles, we first need to understand something about the crocodilian family tree. Modern crocodilians, the crocodiles, alligators, gharials, and caimans that we know today, are semi-aquatic ambush predators. They spend much of their time in water, and they hunt primarily by lurking at the water's edge and seizing prey animals that come to drink. Their body plan, with its low, sprawling posture, heavy armored skin, and powerful jaws, is superbly adapted for this semi-aquatic ambush lifestyle. But this is not the only body plan that crocodilians have ever had. The crocodilian lineage, remember, is ancient. These animals first appeared during the Triassic period, and in those early days, the lineage was extraordinarily diverse. Triassic and Jurassic crocodilians included fully terrestrial forms with upright postures, small agile runners, even herbivorous species. The semi-aquatic ambush lifestyle that we associate with modern crocodilians is actually a relatively derived condition, a specialized ecological strategy that was adopted by one particular branch of the crocodilian family tree. Other branches took very different paths. And in the Cenozoic era, one particular lineage of crocodilians took a path that was, by any standard, remarkable. This was the lineage of the Pristichampsines, the running crocodiles or land crocodiles, and their story is one of the most fascinating episodes in the history of terrestrial predation. The Pristichampsines were a group of crocodilians that lived during the Paleogene period, primarily during the Eocene epoch, roughly 56 to 34 million years ago. They are known from fossils found in multiple regions, and they were characterized by a suite of anatomical features that distinguished them sharply from their aquatic relatives. The most immediately striking feature of the Pristichampsines was their legs. Unlike modern crocodilians, whose short, sprawling limbs are designed for low-speed movement on land and powerful swimming in water, the Pristichampsines had longer, more slender limbs positioned more directly beneath the body. This upright, or semi-upright, posture would have allowed them to move much more efficiently on land than any modern crocodilian, with longer strides and greater speed. They were, in a very real sense, built for running. Their feet were equally distinctive. Modern crocodilians have webbed feet adapted for swimming. The Pristichampsines, by contrast, had hoofed toes. Yes, you read that correctly. These crocodilians had hooves, not unlike those of modern ungulates. This extraordinary adaptation, unique among crocodilians, speaks to the degree to which these animals had committed to a fully terrestrial lifestyle. Hooves are adaptations for running on hard ground, for high-speed locomotion, and their presence in a crocodilian indicates an animal that was spending the vast majority of its time on dry land, moving quickly across open terrain. The skull of the Pristichampsines was also modified for terrestrial predation. While it retained the general elongated shape and powerful jaw musculature typical of crocodilians, it was more narrow and more highly arched than in aquatic species. The teeth were xiphidont, meaning they were laterally compressed, serrated, and recurved, like the teeth of carnivorous dinosaurs. This tooth's shape is ideal for cutting through flesh and holding on to struggling prey, and it is very different from the conical, interlocking teeth of modern crocodilians, which are designed for gripping slippery fish and holding large prey while it drowns. The combination of these features, the upright posture, the long running legs, the hooved feet, the serrated teeth, paints a picture of an animal that was fundamentally different from any modern crocodilian. The Pristichampsines were fast, agile, terrestrial predators, hunting on dry land rather than in the water. The most famous and best studied member of this group is Pristichampsus rallinaceae, which gives the group its name. Fossil material of Pristichampsus has been found in Europe and in other regions, dating to the Eocene epoch. Based on the known fossil material, Pristichampsus was a medium to large-sized animal, probably reaching lengths of 2 to 3 meters, roughly 6 to 10 feet, and weights of perhaps 100 to 200 kilograms. While not the largest predator of its ecosystem, Pristichampsus was a significant and formidable hunter. In the Eocene world, it would have shared its habitat with a variety of early mammals, including the ancestors of modern horses, tapirs, rhinoceroses, and other ungulates, as well as early carnivorous mammals of various kinds. A fast-running, serrated-toothed crocodilian, capable of chasing prey across open ground and delivering slashing, dinosaur-like bites, would have been a major predatory force in this community. Picture the Eocene landscape. It is a world of subtropical forests and open woodlands, warm and humid, filled with a variety of early mammal species that would be largely unrecognizable to a modern observer. The early horses are the size of dogs, with 4 or 3 toes on each foot. The early rhinoceroses are hornless and relatively slender. The early tapirs are small and pig-like. And moving through this community, combining the hunting strategy of a carnivorous theropod with the physical armored toughness of a crocodilian, is Pristochampsus. The osteoderms, the bony skin plates, were still present in Pristochampsus, as they are in all crocodilians. But in this terrestrial predator, they served a slightly different function than in the aquatic relatives. Rather than providing protection from underwater struggles, they armored the animal against the defensive kicks and bites of terrestrial prey. A Pristochampsus attacking a medium-sized mammal would have had significant protection against the hooves and teeth of its struggling victim, while its own serrated teeth and powerful jaws delivered debilitating wounds. The Pristochampsines represent one of the most remarkable convergent evolutionary experiments in the history of tetrapod life. Convergent evolution is the process by which distantly related organisms independently evolve similar features in response to similar selective pressures. We see it everywhere in the history of life: the streamlined body shape of dolphins, ichthyosaurs, and sharks, the wings of bats, birds, and pterosaurs, the sharp, slicing teeth of marsupial thylacosmelids and placental saber-toothed cats. In each case, similar ecological challenges produce similar evolutionary solutions. The Pristochampsines represent convergent evolution between crocodilians and the great terrestrial predators that had come before them, particularly the carnivorous dinosaurs. They evolved serrated, dinosaur-like teeth. They evolved an upright, dinosaur-like posture. They evolved the hooved feet needed for fast terrestrial locomotion. Starting from a crocodilian ancestor, they independently arrived at something that, in many respects, functioned like a small carnivorous dinosaur. This is a deeply unsettling thought, if you dwell on it. The adaptations that make a great terrestrial predator are not arbitrary. They are the logical outcomes of the selective pressures imposed by a terrestrial environment and a predatory lifestyle. Serrated teeth for cutting flesh, upright posture for efficient locomotion, good sensory systems for detecting and tracking prey. These things evolve again and again, in different lineages, at different times, because they work. Because the physics of killing on land are the same regardless of whether the killer is a dinosaur, a mammal, or a crocodile. The Pristochampsines flourished during the Eocene and into the early Oligocene, occupying the role of medium-sized terrestrial predator in the ecosystems of the ancient world. But they were not the only remarkable predators of the early Cenozoic, and in the overall hierarchy of predation, they were not the apex. That position was contested by a variety of other animals, some mammalian, some avian, all of them fascinating in their own right. One group of early Cenozoic predators deserves special mention, even though they are not the focus of our main narrative, because they represent one of the most unexpected predatory dynasties in the history of life. These are the Phorusrhacids, the terror birds. The Phorusrhacids were flightless birds, members of a group that evolved in South America following the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. They were characterized by enormous, axe-like beaks, powerful legs, and in the largest species, body sizes that rivaled the great carnivorous mammals. The largest Phorusrhacids, like Coelenchon, stood over 2 meters tall and may have weighed over 250 kilograms. They were bipedal, like their theropod ancestors, and they hunted in a similar fashion, using their massive beaks to deliver devastating blows to their prey. The Phorusrhacids dominated the South American terrestrial predator niche for tens of millions of years, during the period when South America was an island continent, separated from North America by the seaway that would eventually close to form Central America. On this island continent, in the absence of large carnivorous placental mammals, the terror birds rose to the apex of the food chain and stayed there for an extraordinarily long time. But the terror birds are not our primary focus today, and we mention them here mainly to illustrate the diversity of predatory strategies that emerged in the wake of the dinosaur extinction. The early Cenozoic was a world of evolutionary experimentation, where the rules had been reset and new players were trying out new strategies. Some of those strategies, like the hooved land crocodiles and the axe-beaked terror birds, were startlingly different from anything that had existed before. Others were more familiar variations on themes that had been well established in the Mesozoic. And one of those familiar themes was the evolution of large, powerful, carnivorous mammals. The evolution of carnivorous mammals in the Cenozoic is a story of multiple parallel lineages, each developing its own suite of predatory adaptations, each filling somewhat different ecological niches, and each competing with the others and with non-mammalian predators for the right to sit at the top of the food chain. The earliest carnivorous mammals of the Paleogene belong to groups that are now entirely extinct, groups with names like the creodonts and the condylarths. These were the pioneers of mammalian predation, the animals that first established the tradition of large, warm-blooded, fur-covered killing machines that would eventually culminate in lions, tigers, and bears. But they were not yet the highly specialized, supremely efficient predators that their descendants would become. They were, in many ways, transitional forms, displaying a mix of ancestral generalized features and newly evolved predatory adaptations. The creodonts, in particular, were a diverse group of carnivorous mammals that dominated terrestrial predation for much of the Paleogene. They ranged from small, weasel-like animals to large, powerful predators comparable to modern bears. Their teeth included carnassial pairs, modified cheek teeth that sheared against each other like scissor blades to slice through meat, an adaptation that is also found in modern carnivorans. They were effective predators, and they persisted for tens of millions of years. But they were eventually replaced by the carnivorans, the group that includes all modern predatory mammals. As the Paleogene gave way to the Neogene, roughly 23 million years ago, the carnivoran mammals were well established as the dominant terrestrial predators. The dogs, cats, bears, mustelids, and their relatives had diversified into an extraordinary array of forms, ranging from small mongooses to massive cave bears. The ecosystems of the Neogene world were increasingly similar to those of the modern world, with familiar groups of herbivores, familiar groups of predators, and familiar patterns of ecological interaction. But within this increasingly familiar world, there were still predators of extraordinary and almost incomprehensible size. The Cenozoic produced some of the largest carnivorous mammals in the history of life, animals that make modern predators look modest by comparison. And one of them, one particular species that lived during the Pleistocene epoch, the last major epoch before our own, deserves to be recognized as one of the greatest land predators in the history of the Cenozoic. This animal is Arctotherium angustidens, the short-faced bear, and it was a monster by any definition of the word. Before we discuss Arctotherium specifically, let us spend a moment with the short-faced bears as a group, because they represent one of the most remarkable evolutionary lineages in the history of Cenozoic predation. The short-faced bears belong to the family Ursidae, which includes all modern bears, but they belong to a separate subfamily, Tremarctini, which evolved separately from the subfamily that includes modern brown bears, polar bears, and black bears. The Tremarctan bears, the short-faced bears and their relatives, evolved primarily in the Americas, and they developed some of the most impressive body sizes ever achieved by terrestrial carnivorous mammals. The name short-faced bear refers to the relatively compact, broad facial structure of these animals compared to other bears. Modern bears tend to have elongated, somewhat dog-like snouts. The short-faced bears had broader, more robust faces, with larger jaw muscles relative to face length, resulting in a more powerful bite than their modern relatives. The most famous North American short-faced bear is Arctodus simus, which lived during the late Pleistocene and was long considered the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore to ever inhabit the continent. Arctodus was a formidable creature, with some individuals estimated to have weighed over 700 kilograms, roughly 1,500 pounds. It stood about 1.5 meters tall at the shoulder, and when standing upright, it would have reached a height of roughly 3.5 meters, over 11 feet. It had long, slender limbs relative to other bears, which led early researchers to suggest that it was a pursuit predator, capable of running down prey over long distances. However, more recent analyses have suggested a more nuanced picture of Arctidus's lifestyle. Isotopic studies of its bones suggest that it ate a wide variety of foods, including large amounts of plant material, and that it may have been more of an omnivore or even a specialized scavenger than a dedicated pursuit predator. The debate about the lifestyle of Arctidus is ongoing, and different researchers have reached quite different conclusions about whether it was primarily a hunter, primarily a scavenger, or some combination of the two. But whatever the ecological habits of the North American short-faced bear, it was not the largest member of its family. That distinction belongs to Arctotherium angustidens, the South American short-faced bear, which lived during the early to middle Pleistocene, roughly 2.5 to 1 million years ago. Arctotherium angustidens was, quite simply, one of the largest land carnivores that ever existed. Estimates of its body mass, based on analysis of its fossil bones, range from 900 kilograms to over 1,700 kilograms, with some analyses suggesting it could have exceeded 2 metric tons. Even the conservative estimates place it firmly among the largest terrestrial predatory mammals in Earth's history, comparable in weight to a small car. To put this in perspective, the largest modern brown bears, the Kodiak bears of coastal Alaska, typically weigh between 200 and 700 kilograms, with the very largest individuals occasionally exceeding 600 kilograms. A large male lion weighs about 180 to 250 kilograms. A large male tiger weighs about 150 to 300 kilograms. Even the enormous cave bear of the Pleistocene, Ursus spilius, typically weighed only 400 to 600 kilograms. Arctotherium angustidens was potentially 3 times heavier than a Kodiak bear. It was potentially 10 times heavier than a large lion. If the upper estimates of its body mass are correct, it was heavier than any other terrestrial carnivoran in the history of life. The skull of Arctotherium was enormous and heavily built, with broad zygomatic arches providing attachment surfaces for massive jaw muscles. The teeth were large and robust, with prominent canines and well-developed carnassials. The overall impression is of an animal with a significantly more powerful bite than any modern bear, an animal that was well equipped for processing large, tough food items, whether those items were large prey animals or the bones of carcasses. The limbs of Arctotherium were massive, with thick, robust bones that speak to the enormous weight they had to support. Unlike the relatively slender limbs of the North American short-faced bear, which had been interpreted as adaptations for running, the limbs of Arctotherium suggest a more heavily built, powerful but less fleet-footed animal. Arctotherium was probably not a pursuit predator in the manner that has sometimes been proposed for Arctidus. It was more likely an ambush predator or an opportunistic hunter, relying on overwhelming power and surprise rather than speed and endurance. And what prey was available to a predator of this size? During the early to middle Pleistocene in South America, the available prey was extraordinary. The Great American Biotic Interchange, the mixing of North and South American faunas that occurred following the formation of the Central American land bridge approximately 3 million years ago, had produced a remarkable and diverse megafauna. South America in the Pleistocene was home to giant ground sloths, some species of which weighed several tons, glyptodonts which were armadillo relatives the size of small cars, toxodons which were large rhino-like ungulates, horses, llamas, and various other large mammals. For Arctotherium, this diverse megafauna represented a potentially enormous food resource. A predator of its size would have needed to consume enormous quantities of food on a regular basis. A large bear today requires several thousand calories per day to maintain its body weight, and Arctotherium, being significantly heavier than any modern bear, would have required proportionally more. Hunting or scavenging large megafaunal prey, the giant ground sloths and toxodons and horses, would have been the most efficient way to meet these caloric demands. The isotopic analysis of Arctotherium bones has yielded results that suggest it had a highly carnivorous diet, particularly in the early Pleistocene, before the diversity of megafaunal prey began to decline. As the Pleistocene progressed and megafaunal species began to go extinct, the diet of later populations of short-faced bears shifted to include more plant material, a shift that is reflected in changes in the bone and tooth isotope signatures. This dietary flexibility was probably a survival strategy, but it was ultimately insufficient to save the species from extinction as the megafauna that it depended on disappeared. The extinction of Arctotherium and the other short-faced bears is part of the broader story of Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, one of the most debated topics in all of paleontology. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, a global wave of extinction swept through the world's megafaunal communities, eliminating dozens of large animal species on every continent. Mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, glyptodonts, giant wombats, cave lions, cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, and many other large animals disappeared within a geologically brief period. The causes of these extinctions are hotly contested. Climate change, driven by the end of the last ice age, clearly played a role. As the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed and dried, the habitats that supported many megafaunal species changed significantly, reducing or eliminating the plant communities that these large animals depended on. But climate change alone may not explain the timing and selectivity of the extinctions. Many researchers have pointed to the arrival of human hunters as an additional, and perhaps primary, cause of the megafaunal extinctions. The pattern of extinctions correlates disturbingly well with the spread of human populations, and experimental evidence from island ecosystems where humans arrived at known times strongly supports the idea that human hunting pressure was a major driver of megafaunal collapse. For our story, the important point is that the extinction of Arctotherium and the other great Pleistocene predators marks the end of the era of truly giant terrestrial mammalian predators. After the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivores are those we know today, the lions, tigers, bears, and wolves. These are impressive animals, to be sure, but they are smaller than their Pleistocene predecessors, living in a world that has been significantly impoverished of both large prey and large predators. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we discuss the end of the age of great mammalian predators, let us go back and look more carefully at some of the other remarkable predators of the Cenozoic world, animals that deserve more detailed attention than they typically receive in popular accounts. The Cenozoic was an era of extraordinary predatory diversity. The mammals that filled the predator niches vacated by the dinosaurs came in a remarkable variety of forms, and they employed a remarkable variety of strategies. Some were pursuit predators, built for speed and endurance. Others were ambush predators, built for power and surprise. Some had enormous teeth designed for slicing through flesh. Others had crushing jaws designed for processing bone. Some were solitary hunters. Others were social predators that hunted in coordinated groups. Among the most remarkable of the Cenozoic predators were the mesonychids, a group of hoofed carnivorous mammals that dominated parts of the Paleogene. The mesonychids are fascinating because, like the Pristochampsine crocodilians we discussed earlier, they represent an unexpected combination of features. They were ungulates, hoofed animals related to the ancestors of modern whales and hippos, but they had evolved a highly carnivorous lifestyle, with robust skulls and large, triangular, shearing teeth. They occupied a position in the early Cenozoic food web somewhat analogous to that of large dogs or hyenas, though they were more closely related to deer and hippos than to either. The largest mesonychids, like Androsarchus, may have been among the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivores of the Eocene. Androsarchus is known only from a skull, but what a skull it is, over 80 centimeters long, roughly 2.5 feet, with massive, robust teeth and broad, rounded molars suggesting an ability to crush bone as well as slice meat. Based on the skull dimensions and comparisons with related species, estimates of Androsarchus's total body length range from 3.5 to 5 meters, and weight estimates range from 300 kilograms to over a ton. If the higher estimates are correct, Androsarchus was one of the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivores to have ever lived, rivaling Arctotherium for that distinction. But the mesonychids, impressive as they were not destined to rule the Cenozoic. They were gradually outcompeted by the carnivorans, the group of mammals that includes all modern flesh-eating mammals, as the carnivorans evolved larger body sizes, more specialized killing adaptations, and more efficient metabolisms. By the Oligocene, the mesonychids were essentially gone, replaced by wolves, cats, hyenas, and their relatives. Among the carnivorans of the Cenozoic, none are more iconic or more spectacular than the saber-toothed cats. The saber-toothed cats are not a natural group in the strict phylogenetic sense. The term refers to several different lineages of carnivorans that independently evolved enormously elongated upper canine teeth, convergently developing the same striking physical feature for presumably similar functional reasons. The most famous of these lineages belongs to the subfamily Machaerodontinae, the true saber-toothed cats, which includes species like Smilodon, Homotherium, Megantereon, and Machaerodus. The saber-toothed cats were among the most formidable predators of the Cenozoic, and they deserve extended discussion, because they represent one of the most extreme and successful predatory strategies ever evolved. Smilodon fetalis is perhaps the most famous individual species in the entire history of predatory mammals. This North and South American saber-toothed cat, which lived from roughly 2.5 million to 10,000 years ago, is known from thousands of specimens, many of them from the remarkable La Brea tar pits in what is now California, where animals became trapped in natural asphalt seeps and were preserved in extraordinary numbers. Smilodon was a powerfully built animal, somewhat smaller than a modern lion in terms of body length but massively heavier in build. Adult males of Smilodon fetalis weighed approximately 160 to 280 kilograms, with some individuals possibly reaching 300 kilograms or more, heavier than any modern lion. The build of Smilodon was extraordinarily robust, with thick, heavily muscled forelimbs, a short, stiff back, and short, powerful hind limbs. It was clearly not built for high-speed pursuit. It was built for raw, overwhelming power. The defining feature of Smilodon, of course, was its upper canine teeth. These were not merely long teeth. They were extraordinary structures, reaching lengths of 28 centimeters or more in large adults, roughly 11 inches. They were laterally compressed, with serrated edges, and they were slightly curved. The upper lip of Smilodon, like that of modern lions and tigers, had a flap of skin that would have covered and protected the teeth when the mouth was closed. The function of the saber teeth has been debated for over a century, and the discussion continues to this day. The most widely accepted view is that Smilodon used its canines to deliver a precise, powerful killing bite to the throat or underside of the neck of its prey, severing the major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The massive forelimbs and muscular chest were used to wrestle the prey to the ground and hold it immobile, while the killing bite was delivered. Once the prey was pinned and unable to struggle effectively, Smilodon would drive its sabers into the exposed throat, and the hunt would be over. This killing technique required the prey to be thoroughly subdued before the bite was delivered, because the saber teeth, for all their impressive length, were actually somewhat brittle relative to the robust teeth of bone-crushing predators. They could deliver devastating wounds to soft tissue, but they were vulnerable to breakage if they struck bone or if the prey was still struggling violently. The powerful, wrestling-focused forelimbs of Smilodon were therefore not just incidental features. They were essential components of the killing system, allowing the cat to control and immobilize its prey before committing to the potentially risky killing bite. The prey of Smilodon in its North American range included horses, bison, camels, and ground sloths, all of which were larger and more heavily built than the prey of most modern big cats. The robust body plan of Smilodon, its short legs, its massive forelimbs, its stiff back, makes much more sense in the context of wrestling prey animals that could weigh several hundred kilograms or more. It was a predator built for taking down very large, very dangerous prey, and every feature of its anatomy reflects this specialization. Smilodon was also, based on evidence from the La Brea tar pits, a social animal. Among the thousands of Smilodon specimens from La Brea, a significant proportion show evidence of serious injuries, broken limbs, dislocated joints, severe tooth damage, that had healed over during the animal's lifetime. An animal with such an injury would have been unable to hunt effectively for weeks or months, and in the wild, a predator that cannot hunt typically starves to death. The fact that these animals survived their injuries and healed suggests that they were being provisioned with food by other members of their group, other Smilodons sharing kills with injured companions. This behavior, provisioning injured group members, is seen in modern social predators like wolves and lions, and it suggests that Smilodon had a comparable degree of social organization. A social Smilodon, hunting in groups, sharing kills, and potentially coordinating attacks on very large prey, would have been one of the most formidable predators in the Pleistocene world. Pack behavior dramatically increases the effective predatory power of even individual animals that are already formidable hunters, and in the context of Smilodon's physical capabilities, the implications are staggering. Beyond Smilodon, the Cenozoic world was home to a remarkable diversity of other large predatory mammals. The Felidae, the cat family, produced not only the saber-tooths but also the lineage that would eventually give rise to the great cats of the modern world, the lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, and cheetahs. The Hyenidae, the hyena family, produced some of the most powerful bone-crushing predators in the Cenozoic, including the massive Pachycracuta, the giant hyena, which could weigh over 100 kilograms and had a bite force powerful enough to crush the thigh bones of mammoths. The Ursidae, the bear family, produced not only the short-faced bears but also the enormous cave bear of Eurasia, Ursus spilius, a massive omnivore that could weigh over 600 kilograms. The Canidae, the dog family, produced an extraordinary range of predatory forms, from the small, agile foxes to the massive, bone-crushing Epicyon, sometimes called the bear dog, which was one of the largest canids ever to exist, weighing up to 170 kilograms and possessing a skull proportion more like a hyena than a dog, with massive jaw muscles and bone-crushing dentition. And then there were the amphicyonids, the bear dogs, which despite their common name were not closely related to either bears or dogs but represented an entirely separate lineage of large carnivorous mammals. The amphicyonids were among the dominant large predators of the Oligocene and Miocene, and some of them grew to impressive sizes. Amphicyon itself, the type genus of the family, could reach weights of over 200 kilograms, comparable to a large lion. It had a robust build, powerful jaws, and a combination of dog-like and bear-like features that reflects its taxonomic position midway between the two modern families. The diversity of Cenozoic predators is, in a word, staggering. Over the 66 million years of the Cenozoic era, hundreds of species of large carnivorous mammals evolved, thrived, and in most cases, eventually went extinct. They occupied every major continent, they exploited every major terrestrial habitat, and they pursued prey animals of every size from small rodents to giant proboscideans. The Cenozoic world was not a peaceful, pastoral landscape. It was a world in which the threat of predation was constant and immediate, in which every large herbivore was engaged in a continuous arms race with the predators that pursued it, in which the development of horns and armor and social defensive behaviors was driven by the relentless selective pressure of being hunted. Let us now turn to a more detailed examination of some of the specific predatory ecosystems of the Cenozoic, to get a sense of what these communities looked like in their full ecological context. The Miocene epoch, which spans from approximately 23 to 5 million years ago, was in many ways the golden age of Cenozoic predatory diversity. The Miocene world was warm and lush, with extensive forests and savannas supporting enormous populations of large herbivores. The fossil record of the Miocene reveals a world teeming with life, a world that in its overall character was not entirely unlike the modern African savanna, but on a global scale and with a level of diversity that dwarfs anything we see today. In Miocene Africa and Eurasia, the large predators included multiple species of Machaerodont saber-toothed cats, hunting in the same ecosystems alongside the ancestors of modern lions and leopards. Large hyenas patrolled the same savannas, scavenging kills and occasionally hunting for themselves. Bear dogs prowled the forest margins. And in the trees and underbrush, smaller predatory mammals competed for the smaller prey animals that filled the lower trophic levels. Miocene North America was equally rich in large predators. Bear dogs hunted alongside early horses and primitive camels. Several lineages of large cats pursued the diverse ungulate fauna. Bone-crushing dogs competed for carcasses with amphicyonid relatives. The sheer density and diversity of large predators in Miocene North America was remarkable, comparable to or even exceeding that of the modern African savanna, and it reflects the extraordinary productivity of the Miocene ecosystem. The Pliocene epoch, from approximately 5 to 2.5 million years ago, saw some significant changes in global climate and ecosystem structure. The climate cooled and dried relative to the Miocene, and the extensive forests of the earlier epoch gave way in many regions to more open savannas and grasslands. This shift in vegetation type favored different kinds of herbivores and, consequently, different kinds of predators. The large, forest-dwelling ungulates that had dominated the Miocene were increasingly replaced by faster, more cursorial grassland herbivores, and the predators evolved to keep pace. It was also during the Pliocene that the Great American Biotic Interchange occurred, with the formation of the Central American land bridge allowing faunas to mix between North and South America for the first time in tens of millions of years. This event had profound consequences for the terrestrial predators of both continents. The North American carnivorans, including saber-toothed cats and large canids, moved south into South America, where they encountered and eventually outcompete many of the endemic South American predators, including the terror birds. Meanwhile, some South American predators, including the giant short-faced bears, moved north into North America, adding to the already diverse predator community there. The result was a mixed, globalized Pleistocene predator community of extraordinary richness. At the peak of Pleistocene megafaunal diversity, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, the large predator community of the Americas included Smilodon fatalis, the saber-toothed cat, Arctodus simus, the North American short-faced bear, Maracinonyx, the American cheetah, Panthera atrox, the American lion, which was larger than any modern lion, Canis dirus, the dire wolf, a massive, heavily built wolf significantly larger than its modern gray wolf relative, and various other species of smaller cats, bears, and canids. The existence of this diverse predator community alongside an equally diverse megaherbivore community, with mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, bison, tapirs, and peccaries, created one of the most ecologically complex terrestrial communities in the history of the Cenozoic. It was a world of constant ecological interaction, of predator-prey dynamics playing out on a continental scale, of arms races between hunters and hunted that drove the evolution of both. And then it was gone. The Pleistocene megafaunal extinction swept through this community with devastating thoroughness. By about 10,000 years ago, most of the great megafaunal herbivores and the predators that depended on them were extinct. The mammoths were gone. The mastodons were gone. The giant ground sloths were gone. Smilodon was gone. Arctodus was gone. The American lion was gone. The dire wolf was gone. What remained was a significantly impoverished community. The modern large predators of the Americas, the pumas, the jaguars, the gray wolves, the grizzly bears, are all impressive animals. But they are smaller than their Pleistocene predecessors, and they live in a world that has been stripped of most of the large prey species that sustained the great predatory megafauna. The pattern was similar on other continents, though the timing and extent of the extinctions varied. In Eurasia, the cave lion, the cave bear, and the woolly rhinoceros were among the casualties. In Australia, the giant marsupial carnivore Thylacoleo carnifex, an extraordinarily specialized predator with blade-like teeth that could deliver one of the most powerful bites relative to body size of any known mammal, disappeared along with the giant kangaroos and wombats that were its prey. In Africa, the extinctions were less severe, possibly because the African megafauna had co-evolved with human hunters for millions of years and had developed some behavioral resistance to human predation pressure. But even Africa lost some of its largest Pleistocene megafaunal species. This brings us to the present, or at least to the very recent past. The world we live in today, in terms of its large animal communities, is a depleted world. It is a world that has been shaped by human hunting pressure, human habitat modification, and human-caused climate change to a degree that makes it a poor representative of what Earth's terrestrial ecosystems typically look like over geological time. The great predators that once ruled every continent, from the terror birds of South America to the saber-toothed cats of every major landmass, are gone. What remains is a shadow of what once existed. But let us not end our story on a note of loss. Let us instead reflect on what the full sweep of this history tells us, because there are lessons here that go far beyond the simple recitation of impressive animals and their vital statistics. The first lesson is one of scale. The history of terrestrial predation spans more than 400 million years. 400 million years. This is a span of time so vast that it genuinely defies human comprehension. The entire recorded history of human civilization is roughly 5,000 years, a rounding error in geological terms. The entire existence of our species, Homo sapiens, is roughly 300,000 years. The first terrestrial predators, the trigonotarbids of the Devonian, evolved roughly 1,300 times longer ago than our species has existed. In that vast span of time, the predators of the land have changed beyond all recognition. From millimeter-scale arachnids to 12-meter tyrannosaurs, from hoofed crocodilians to saber-toothed cats to short-faced bears the size of small cars, the diversity of forms that evolution has produced in response to the challenge of terrestrial predation is staggering. And yet, underlying all this diversity, there are common themes, common solutions to common problems, that speak to the fundamental physics and biology of being a killer on land. The second lesson is about arms races. The history of terrestrial predation is, at its core, a history of arms races between predators and prey. Every adaptation that makes a predator more effective creates selective pressure for prey animals to evolve better defenses, and every improvement in prey defenses creates selective pressure for predators to evolve better weapons and strategies. This relentless back and forth drives the evolution of both groups, producing ever more extreme adaptations on both sides. We see this dynamic playing out throughout the history we have traced. The evolution of armored herbivores like ankylosaurids and ceratopsians drove the evolution of more powerful predatory tools in the tyrannosaurs. The evolution of thick-shelled mollusks and heavily armored fish drove the evolution of stronger-jawed aquatic predators. The evolution of fast-running prey animals like the cursorial ungulates of the Cenozoic drove the evolution of faster, more endurance-oriented predators in the carnivorans. Every spectacular feature of every predator we have discussed, from the hatchet skull of Allosaurus to the bone-crushing jaws of Tyrannosaurus rex to the saber teeth of Smilodon, is the product of this arms race. It is the product of millions of years of selection pressure, driving the evolution of ever more extreme tools for the fundamental business of killing. The third lesson is about contingency. The history of terrestrial predation is not a smooth, linear progression from simple to complex, from small to large, from primitive to advanced. It is a history full of contingency, of dead ends and unexpected turns, of extinctions that reset the ecological stage and allow entirely new castes of predators to evolve in the aftermath. If the end Permian extinction had not occurred, would the synapsids have continued to dominate the land? Would the great predators of the Mesozoic world have been mammal-like rather than reptilian? We cannot know. If the Triassic extinction had not cleared the way for dinosaurian dominance, would the Pseudosuchians like Phaseolacicus have continued to reign? If the asteroid had not struck 66 million years ago, would the Tyrannosaurs still be with us today, adapted and evolved into forms we cannot imagine? These are fascinating counterfactual questions, and they remind us that the history we have traced is not the only history that could have been. Evolution does not have a goal. It does not progress toward a predetermined endpoint. It simply responds to the selective pressures of the current moment, using the genetic material available, producing adaptations that work well enough in the current environment to allow reproduction. The fact that 400 million years of this process has produced organisms of such extraordinary complexity and capability is not the result of a plan. It is the result of an enormous number of small steps, each one blind, each one responding only to immediate circumstances, adding up over geological time to something that looks, from the outside, like directed progress but is in fact nothing of the kind. This makes the history of life, and the history of predation in particular, even more remarkable. Without a plan, without a designer, without any long-term goal, the process of evolution has produced, starting from nothing more than microbial life in an ancient ocean, the trigonotarbids and the scorpions and the gorgonopsians and the tyrannosaurs and the saber-toothed cats. It has produced, in other words, genuine monsters. Real monsters, made of flesh and bone and evolutionary history, that are in many ways more extraordinary than anything our imaginations have been able to conjure. Let us now trace the final threads of our story, looking at some of the last great predators before we close this chapter of Earth's history and reflect on what we have learned. The late Pleistocene, the period from roughly 100,000 to 10,000 years ago, was the final act of the great megafaunal drama. And in this final act, some of the most remarkable predators in the history of the Cenozoic were still at large. Panthera atrox, the American lion, deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts. This massive felid, known from fossils found across North America and parts of South America, was significantly larger than any modern lion. Estimates of its body mass range from 250 to 350 kilograms, making it perhaps 25% heavier than the largest modern African lions. Its skull was proportionally large relative to its body, with massive jaw muscles and large canine teeth. The American lion is closely related to, but distinct from, the Eurasian cave lion, Panthera spilea, another massive Pleistocene felid that has left behind cave paintings made by our ancestors, haunting images of great cats that speak to the profound impression these animals made on the early humans who shared their world. Both the American lion and the cave lion were among the dominant large predators of their respective continents, hunting the megafaunal herbivores that populated the late Pleistocene landscape. In Eurasia, the cave lion competed with another extraordinary predator, the spotted hyena, Crocuta crocuta, which in the Pleistocene was both larger and more widely distributed than it is today. Modern spotted hyenas are often underestimated as predators. Despite their reputation as scavengers, they are actually highly effective hunters, capable of running prey to exhaustion over long distances and bringing down animals much larger than themselves when hunting in packs. In the Pleistocene, with larger body sizes and a diverse megafaunal prey base, spotted hyenas were major predators in Eurasian ecosystems, competing with lions and other large felids for access to prey. The interaction between these great Pleistocene predators and the increasingly numerous and technologically sophisticated human hunters who shared their world is one of the most intriguing and consequential stories in the history of life. Our ancestors were, even by the standards of the remarkable predators we have been discussing, extraordinary hunters. They had intelligence that dwarfed anything in the animal kingdom. They had language, which allowed them to coordinate complex group hunts. They had tools and weapons, first stone-tipped spears and then more sophisticated projectile weapons, that allowed them to kill prey at a distance, eliminating one of the greatest risks of hunting large and dangerous animals. With these advantages, human hunters proved to be devastatingly effective at taking down megafaunal prey. A hunting band of a dozen individuals armed with stone-tipped spears could coordinate an attack that would allow them to kill a mammoth or a giant ground sloth, prey animals that no other predator of comparable individual size could have taken down alone. And as human populations grew and human hunting technology improved, the cumulative pressure on megafaunal prey populations became unsustainable. The megafaunal extinctions, as we have noted, are still debated. But the timing of the extinctions, and the selectivity of the extinctions for large-bodied species that would have been the most attractive targets for human hunters seeking maximum nutritional return for hunting effort, strongly suggests that human hunting played a major role. The predators that were dependent on the megafaunal prey were collateral casualties, starved out as their food base disappeared. Smilodon, which had been hunting horses and ground sloths for millions of years, found its prey base collapsing. The dire wolf, adapted for hunting large prey animals in coordinated packs, found the large prey animals gone. The American lion and the American cheetah, both built for hunting the swift ungulates of the Pleistocene grasslands, found those ungulates disappearing. Without their prey, the great predators followed their victims into extinction. And when they were gone, the world was quieter and safer than it had been since before the Devonian. The great predators of the Cenozoic, the final chapter in our 400 million year story, were over. Or were they? Here we must consider a question that lurks beneath the surface of everything we have discussed. The question of what constitutes the greatest land predator. We have been measuring predators by their size, their bite force, their weaponry, their hunting strategies. By these metrics, Tyrannosaurus rex stands as the greatest, with the Cenozoic megapredators running a close second. But there is another candidate that we have not yet seriously considered. A predator that is, by any objective measure of ecological impact, the most devastating terrestrial predator in the entire history of life on Earth. A predator that has driven more species to extinction, eliminated more ecosystems, and reshaped more of the planet's surface than any tyrannosaur or saber-toothed cat or short-faced bear could ever have dreamed of. That predator is Homo sapiens. Us. Modern humans. Now, before you object that this is a different kind of discussion, let us be clear about what we mean. We are not making a moral argument here. We are making a biological and ecological observation. The history of terrestrial predation, traced from the first trigonotarbids of the Devonian to the present, ultimately leads to an animal of modest physical dimensions, no claws, no fangs of note, no armor, no venom. But with a brain of extraordinary complexity and a capacity for technological innovation that has allowed it to dominate and reshape the planet's surface to a degree that no other predator has ever achieved. Humans are, in the strict ecological sense, apex predators. We sit at the top of virtually every food chain we are part of. We hunt prey that ranges from tiny fish to the largest whales. We have eliminated apex predators from ecosystems around the world, not because we outcompete them physically, but because our intelligence and our technology have made physical competition essentially irrelevant. We have caused or contributed to the extinction of dozens of megafaunal species. We have converted forests and grasslands and wetlands into agricultural land, eliminating the habitats that supported entire predatory communities. The trajectory from the first trigonotarbid hunting a springtail in the Devonian leaf litter to the modern human hunting mammoth on the Pleistocene steppe is not, perhaps, as discontinuous as it might appear. In both cases, a predator is using the tools at its disposal, however simple or however sophisticated, to acquire food from the living world around it. The trigonotarbid used its chelicerae and its sensory systems. We use our intelligence and our technology. The difference in scale is enormous, but the fundamental relationship, the predator-prey dynamic that has driven the evolution of terrestrial life for 400 million years, is the same. This observation carries a weight of responsibility. We are the inheritors of a predatory tradition that stretches back to the Devonian period. We are the most recent and most capable expression of the evolutionary process that produced trigonotarbids and scorpions and synapsids and dinosaurs and saber-toothed cats. And we are the first species in that entire lineage that has the awareness and the capacity to choose how we exercise our predatory power. The great predators of the past had no choice. Pulmonoscorpius killed because killing was how it survived. Tyrannosaurus rex hunted because hunting was the only option its biology provided. Smilodon attacked because attack was the imperative wired into its nervous system by millions of years of natural selection. They were, in the most fundamental sense, prisoners of their own evolutionary history. We are not. We have the cognitive capacity to understand what we are, to understand the history we are part of, and to make choices about how we behave in the world. The history of terrestrial predation, this 400 million year saga of escalating arms races and ecological dominance, ends with a creature that can look back at the entire sweep of that history and decide, consciously and deliberately, what kind of predator it wants to be. That is a remarkable and sobering thing to contemplate. But let us return to the fossil record for our conclusion, because the fossil record has more to tell us about the nature of predation and the trajectory of life on Earth. One of the most striking patterns in the history of terrestrial predation, when you step back and look at the full sweep of 400 million years, is the relentless increase in the scale and complexity of the predator-prey dynamic. The first land predators were tiny animals hunting even tinier prey. The latest and greatest, the tyrannosaurs and the saber-toothed cats, were massive animals hunting equally massive prey. The arms race between predators and prey, driven by natural selection, has over geological time produced an escalating series of adaptations, each one more extreme than the last. This pattern reflects something fundamental about the nature of evolution and the nature of ecosystems. Competition is the engine of evolution, and predation is competition at its most intense, most immediate, and most unforgiving. The predator that fails to catch its prey goes hungry. The prey animal that fails to escape its predator dies. The selective pressure is relentless and unambiguous. And over geological time, this relentless selective pressure produces extraordinary results. We have seen, in the course of this story, adaptations of breathtaking creativity and effectiveness. The hatchet skull of Allosaurus, designed to deliver devastating slashing blows with maximum force. The bone-crushing dentition of Tyrannosaurus rex, capable of exerting forces measured in tens of thousands of newtons. The saber-teeth of Smilodon, 28-centimeter weapons of serrated bone designed for a precise, anatomically specific killing stroke. The running legs of Pristochampsus, allowing a crocodilian to hunt like a dinosaur. The massively reinforced skull of Anteosaurus, combining predatory power with what may have been display function. Each of these adaptations is a solution to a specific problem, developed by the blind process of natural selection over millions of generations, honed to a precision and effectiveness that human engineers might envy. They are the products of the greatest design process ever devised, one that has been running continuously for over 400 million years, using an almost incomprehensible number of trial and error experiments, keeping what works and discarding what does not. The results speak for themselves. From the Trigonotarbids in the Devonian leaf litter to Tyrannosaurus rex on the Cretaceous floodplain to Arctotherium in the Pleistocene pampas, the history of terrestrial predation is a story of biological achievement that should fill us with wonder. These animals were not monsters, not in the pejorative sense of that word. They were perfectly adapted products of their environments and their evolutionary histories, each one exquisitely suited to the ecological role it played, each one the culmination of millions of years of refinement. They ruled their worlds. They shaped the evolution of every prey animal and every ecosystem they inhabited. They left their marks in the fossil record, in the bone marks of their kills, in the evolutionary adaptations of the animals that tried to escape them, in the genetic legacy of the descendants of the prey animals that survived. And then, one by one, they were gone. Swept away by the same processes that had brought them into existence: geological change, climatic upheaval, ecological disruption, the contingent catastrophes of mass extinction events. The great predators of each era were the products of their times, perfectly suited to the worlds that produced them and ultimately unable to survive the worlds those environments transformed into. This is, perhaps, the deepest lesson of the entire story. No matter how formidable a predator becomes, no matter how perfectly adapted to its environment, no matter how dominant in its ecosystem, it remains at the mercy of the larger forces of geological and climatic change that shaped the planet over deep time. Tyrannosaurus rex was the most powerful land predator in the history of life, but it could not survive an asteroid impact. Smilodon was the most specialized mammalian predator ever evolved, but it could not survive the extinction of its prey base. Arctotherium may have been the heaviest terrestrial carnivoran that ever existed, but it could not survive the combination of climate change and human hunting pressure that eliminated the megafauna it depended on. Power and adaptation, however impressive, are always relative. They are always relative to the current environment, the current prey base, the current competitive community. When those conditions change, even the mightiest predator can be reduced to nothing. This is a humbling thought, and it applies to us as much as to any other predator in our story. We are, as we have noted, the most ecologically dominant terrestrial predators in the history of life. But we are also, like all of our predatory predecessors, dependent on the stability of the natural systems that sustain us. The ecosystems that we have inherited from the great predatory dynasties of the past, however reduced and simplified they may be compared to their Pleistocene predecessors, are the systems that feed us, water us, clean our air, and regulate our climate. The history of the great predators teaches us that ecological dominance is not permanent. It teaches us that the most powerful animals in any era can be replaced by circumstances beyond their control. And it teaches us, perhaps most importantly, that the greatest predatory success in the short term can be the seed of catastrophic failure in the long term if it destroys the ecological foundations on which it depends. The Trigonotarbids hunted for millions of years in the Devonian forests, and those forests sustained them. The tyrannosaurs hunted for millions of years in the Cretaceous lowlands, and those lowlands sustained them. The saber-toothed cats hunted for millions of years in the Pleistocene savannas, and those savannas sustained them. Each of these great predatory lineages succeeded because it was part of a functioning ecosystem, drawing from the productivity of that ecosystem without destroying its capacity to regenerate. We are part of a functioning ecosystem too. We have been more successful than any previous predator at extracting resources from that ecosystem. But the question of whether we are destroying its capacity to regenerate is one that the fossil record, with its long perspective of geological time, forces us to take seriously. The great predators of the past have much to teach us, and not only about the biological mechanics of hunting and killing. They teach us about the possibility and the fragility of greatness. They teach us about the relentless creativity of the evolutionary process and about the equally relentless power of geological and climatic change to undo what evolution has built. They teach us about ecological interdependence, about the web of relationships that sustains even the mightiest apex predator, and about what happens when that web is torn. In the end, the story of Earth's greatest land predators is a story about life itself. About the extraordinary capacity of living systems to produce complexity and capability from the simplest raw materials. About the fundamental drives, hunger, survival, reproduction, that power every living thing from the smallest bacterium to the largest tyrannosaur. About the way in which those drives, played out over geological time in the relentless arena of natural selection, have shaped the living world into something of almost incomprehensible richness and beauty. We are part of that story. We are, in a very real sense, the latest chapter in a narrative that began in the Devonian leaf litter more than 400 million years ago. We carry within our own evolutionary history the legacy of every predator that has come before us, from the first arachnid that seized the first springtail to the last tyrannosaur that crushed the last triceratops horn in its massive jaws. We are the product of the same process that produced all of them, shaped by the same fundamental forces, driven by the same fundamental imperatives. The difference is that we know this. We can look back, through the fossil record and through the work of the scientists who have devoted their lives to reading it, and see the entire sweep of the story. We can understand our place in it. We can appreciate the extraordinary journey that led from the first tentative steps onto dry land to the world we inhabit today. And with that understanding, perhaps, we can face the future with something more than the blind confidence of a predator at the peak of its power. Perhaps we can face it with the wisdom of creatures who know that power is not permanence, that dominance is not destiny, and that the greatest achievement of the greatest predator in Earth's history would be not to surpass all previous apex predators in the scale of its ecological impact, but to be the first predator in 400 million years to recognize the value of the world it depends on and choose, consciously and deliberately, to sustain it. The fossil record is, at its heart, a record of choices made by the blind process of evolution, choices without consciousness or foresight. We are the first organisms in the history of life to have the capacity to make conscious choices, to look at the trajectory of evolutionary history and decide where we want that trajectory to go next. That is the deepest and most important lesson that the great predators of Earth's history have to offer us. Not their size, not their ferocity, not the impressive specifications of their weaponry, but the perspective their story provides on who we are and what we might become. 400 million years of predators have led, through a chain of contingent events and evolutionary blind alleys and catastrophic extinctions and remarkable recoveries, to a creature sitting here, right now, thinking about all of them, wondering about them, trying to understand them, feeling, perhaps, a mix of terror and admiration and kinship when contemplating these extraordinary animals and the world they inhabited. That sense of wonder, that capacity for reflection and understanding, is uniquely ours. It is, in many ways, the most extraordinary adaptation in the entire history of life on Earth, more extraordinary than the sabers of Smilodon, more powerful than the jaws of Tyrannosaurus rex, more remarkable than the hooved feet of Pristochampsus. It is the adaptation that, if we are wise enough to use it well, might allow us to be not just the most powerful predator in Earth's history, but the first one to understand and honor the living world that made us possible. The monsters that ruled the land are gone. Their bones lie in the rock, preserved by the miraculous accident of fossilization, waiting to be found and studied and wondered at. Their stories are told in calcium phosphate and iron oxide, in tooth marks and trackways and coprolites and claw marks, in the ancient record of a living world that was, in many ways, more violent and more magnificent than anything we know today. But their legacy lives on, in the ecosystems they shaped, in the evolutionary adaptations they drove, in the descendants of the prey animals that survived their attentions and the descendants of the survivors of the mass extinctions that claimed them. It lives on in us, the latest and most self-aware chapter in the longest story ever told. The story of life on Earth. The story of the predator and the prey. The story of the arms race that has driven 400 million years of evolution on the land. The story that began in the Devonian leaf litter with a tiny arachnid seizing an even tinier springtail, and that continues today, in ways both ancient and entirely new, in a world that is recognizably the product of everything that has come before. This has been the story of when monsters ruled the land. Thank you for joining us on this journey through deep time. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this and what you found most remarkable about this extraordinary history. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our future explorations of the deep past and the living world it produced. The story of life on Earth is far from over, and there is so much more still to discover, still to wonder at, still to tell. Until next time.